something is different tonight, and you already know it. Not an emergency, not a crisis, just that quiet undercurrent that runs beneath ordinary days, the feeling that something has shifted, or is shifting, or will shift soon, and you cannot quite name it. The feeling that life is moving in some direction you did not choose, and you are lying here in the dark, trying to decide whether to resist it or rest. You are not alone in this. Not tonight. Not anywhere. All across the world right now. People are lying still with that same undercurrent beneath them. People who have held things tightly and felt them change anyway. People who have loved something and watched it move on. People who have tried to keep one small corner of life exactly as it was and found that even that corner shifts in the night. Every single one of them is discovering what 8 voices discovered across 8 different centuries and 8 different traditions, that impermanence, looked at directly, does not look like an enemy. Tonight, every story returns to that single discovery. 8 stories that looked impermanence in the face, and none of them found an enemy. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? What city? What room? What small corner of the world is holding you right now? Leave it in the comments. I find that it matters. Knowing who is in the dark at the same time I am. I have been thinking about this theme for several months now, long before I chose it for tonight. It came to me during a difficult stretch of my own, when things I had counted on were changing faster than I could absorb them. I kept returning to these stories, these 8 voices, the way each one of them walked directly into what they feared most and came out the other side not victorious, but free. Tonight's voices come from Korea and Sri Lanka, from the mountains of Tibet and the river delta of Vietnam, from the rain-soaked forests of Japan and the heat of Burma, from the vast, philosophical sky of Dzogchen and the wind-swept fortress monasteries of Bhutan. They do not agree on everything. They practiced in different ways, prayed in different languages, understood the mind through different teachings, but they arrived at the same threshold. And what they found there, what each one found, in their own way, through their own grief or their own surrender or their own impossible stillness, is something that belongs to you tonight. These are contemplative stories, not medical or therapeutic advice. They are offered as companions in the night, nothing more and nothing less. So, let the weight of the day settle. Let the body find its natural heaviness in the mattress, the pillow, the blanket. There is nothing you need to understand tonight. Nothing you need to hold on to. If you drift off during one of these stories, that is not a failure. That is the whole point. The stories will continue. The wisdom will do what wisdom does. It works beneath thought, beneath intention, the way water works its way through stone. Slowly, certainly, without force. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders drop, and let us begin. The rain came without warning that evening in 1879. The way so many things come without warning, not with drama, not with thunder, just a steady darkening of the sky above the mountain road, a smell of wet stone rising from the path ahead. Gyeonggae had been walking for hours. He was 30 years old, a celebrated sutra lecturer at Donghaksa Monastery in the Chungcheong Mountains. A man so fluent in the scriptures that abbots twice his age sent young monks to study under him. He could speak on the Diamond Sutra for 3 hours without notes, He knew the Heart Sutra in 4 languages. He had never, in his adult life, gone to sleep uncertain about anything important. He turned off the mountain road toward the nearest village, hoping for shelter, and he found silence where sound should have been. There is a verse so old it no longer feels like a teaching. It feels more like a breath you forgot you were holding. The Buddha spoke it, recorded in the Dhammapada. All conditioned things are impermanent. Sabba Sankara Anicca. Just 5 words in Pali, the kind of sentence that seems obvious until the night you need it, until the moment your body understands it, not as a concept, but as the ground you are standing on. We hear impermanence and we think about loss, about endings, about the slow erosion of things we love. We hear it the way we hear a warning from a doctor, something serious, something requiring acceptance, something that will be painful but necessary to face. The mind goes tight, even reading it, because we have been taught. Somehow, that impermanence is the thing working against us, the current we are always swimming upstream from. The thief in the story that takes what we wanted to keep. Gyeongheo knew this verse. He had lectured on it. He could trace its lineage through centuries of commentary, could explain the 3 marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, non-self, in the cadence of a man who has taught the same material to many different classes of students and knows exactly where to pause for effect. He knew anicca the way you know a word in another language, correctly, usably, without the marrow of it yet. That changed the night he walked into the village. You need to understand something about Gyeongheo before we go further into that wet evening. You need to understand what kind of man was walking on that mountain road. He had entered the monastic life at 9 years old, brought to a temple by his mother after his father died. A small boy from Jeonju in the southern province. The kind of child who memorizes without effort, who asks questions that make adults pause and look at each other. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he was already known. Abbots wrote letters about him. Scholars came to hear him lecture on the Diamond Sutra, on the Avatamsaka, on the Heart Sutra and its nested teachings about emptiness and form. He could take a single verse of the Dhammapada and spend 2 hours unpacking it, tracing its commentarial lineage, its different interpretations across the Korean, Chinese, and Indian traditions, its applications to the specific confusions of contemporary practice. He loved this work. That is important to understand. He was not a bored man, not a man going through motions, not a scholar who had secretly lost his faith and kept teaching out of inertia. He genuinely loved the texts. He genuinely believed that the teachings were true. He had simply, and this is the thing that the village would reveal to him, he had simply never tested whether his belief was made of understanding or of familiarity, whether he knew the fire or just knew the word for fire, whether he was inside the teaching or just very fluent at describing its exterior. He was 30 years old and highly regarded, and walking through mountain rain to visit his first teacher, an old man named Kiho, who had since disrobed and was living as a layperson in Seoul. It was an ordinary errand of affection and respect. He expected to arrive, share tea, perhaps talk through some questions he had been turning over in his lectures. He expected, in other words, what we all expect when we set out towards something familiar, that the world will cooperate with the shape of our plans. The village sat in a fold of the mountains. sheltered from the worst of the wind. He smelled the wood smoke before he saw it, or what he thought was wood smoke. The smell of old cooking fires. Actually, cold ones. He came around the last bend of the road and saw the rooftops below him. The familiar silhouette of a village that had not been abandoned but had simply stopped. The houses were intact. That was the first strange thing. He had half expected some visible catastrophe, a fire, a flood, some physical evidence of what had happened. But the houses stood the same as they always had, their rice straw roofs dark with rain, their wooden gates closed in the ordinary way. A cart sat in the center of the village path, half loaded with firewood, the ox still hitched to it, the ox dead now, collapsed in the harness, its ribs visible beneath dark wet hide. A cooking fire in front of one house had burned down to cold ash. A ceramic pot still balanced over it. Whatever was inside, long past eating. The rain hit the ceramic with a small sound. A soft, patient tapping. Kyung-heo stood at the edge of the village and listened. He did not understand yet. His mind was offering him explanations. Market day. Perhaps some festival in the next village. Everyone gone at once. But his body understood before his mind did, the way the body always does. His feet did not want to move forward. His breath had gone very shallow. The smell was not just cold ash. There was something else underneath it, something that had no name in the vocabulary of his lecturing life. Something that the body recognized before the mind found language for it. He pushed open the gate of the nearest house. Inside, a family, a father, a mother, 2 young children, and an elderly grandmother, all of them dead, arranged almost as they would have been in life, collapsed where the sickness had taken them so fast that there had been no time for arrangement or ceremony. A child's sandals were neatly placed beside the sleeping mat, the way children are taught to leave them. A bowl of water on the low wooden table had a thin film of dust across the surface. The grandmother had fallen in the act of lighting incense. Her hand still held the matchstick, burned to the finger's edge. The stick of incense had caught and burned and gone out, and the ash column still stood in the holder, impossibly intact, waiting to be disturbed. He backed out into the rain. He stood in the village center for a long time, long enough that his robes became completely soaked, the grey wool heavy against his shoulders, his sandals sinking slightly into mud with each small shift of his weight. Long enough that night settled fully over the mountains, and the only light came from a half-obscured moon between moving clouds, throwing pale shadows that gave everything the appearance of breathing. He checked 6 houses, then stopped. There was no one left. The epidemic, cholera, he would learn later, moving through the province like water finding its level, killing in some villages within days, had taken everyone. The whole village. Every person who had woken up a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, with plans and quarrels and cooking fires, and children who left their sandals neatly beside the mat. He was a sutra lecturer who had spent his adult life teaching others about the nature of existence. He sat down in the mud, in the rain, in the center of a village where everyone had died, and he understood for the first time that he understood nothing. Not nothing as in ignorance. He had read more than most men would read in 3 lifetimes. Not nothing as in stupidity or laziness or inattention. Nothing as in The difference between knowing that fire burns and holding your hand in the flame. He had known, in the way of his profession, that all conditioned things are impermanent. He had not known it here, and he pressed one hand flat against his chest, feeling his own heartbeat, steady and unknowing in the dark. He had not known it here, where the body actually lives. He had kept it safely in the realm of concept, filed neatly beside the other concepts, a piece of important furniture in the mansion of his scholarship. And all this time, he thought, all this time I have been explaining a fire from the other side of a wall. He sat in the mud until the cold went deep into his bones. Then he stood, turned away from the village, and walked back up the mountain road in the rain. He did not go to Seoul. He did not visit his old teacher. He could not have explained. If someone had asked, why not? Only that whatever he had been going to say to that old man had become, in one evening, completely inadequate to the things he now needed to understand. When he arrived at the monastery gates before dawn, his students came running. They had been worried. He had been expected. Where had he been? He looked at them in the pale pre-dawn, young men, many of them, with their whole futures in front of them, their notebooks full of careful annotations, their heads full of concepts explained by a man who had not yet understood what he was explaining. He told them to go back to sleep. He went to his room and did not come out for 3 days. On the 4th day, he sent the students away. He was not unkind about it. He wrote letters, found them, other teachers, made sure the transition was handled with care. But he could not continue as he had been. The village had shown him something that could not be unfiled and refiled. A man can spend his whole life teaching others to swim and never once enter the water himself. And the water, when you finally enter it, is nothing like the diagram suggested. The water is cold and dark and real, and the body understands it in places the mind cannot reach. He locked the gate of his room and began to practice. Not the practice of lecturing, not the practice of explanation or commentary or the organized transmission of ideas from one clear mind to another. The practice of Seon, in its most direct form, sitting practice. And the Wadu, the burning question at the heart of Korean Buddhist meditation that had been passed down through the lineage for centuries. What is this? Not as a philosophical puzzle, not as a rhetorical device to dazzle students with, as the only honest question available to a man who had discovered that everything else he knew was still on the safe side of the wall. What is this? What is this that watches thought arise and dissolve? What is this that stood in the mud of that village and felt the world become strange? What is this that has been talking about impermanence for 12 years without once sitting still inside it? He practiced through autumn and into the deep winter. He did not leave the monastery grounds. He stopped taking formal meals and ate only what was brought and left outside his door. The monks who remained heard him sometimes in the night, not in distress, but moving, turning in his small room with the relentless quality of a mind that has finally found the real question and cannot stop pressing it. He sat for hours that became a kind of timelessness. He sat through cold that made the floorboards creak. He sat through the silence of snowfall and the silence after snowfall when the mountain holds its breath. In the spring, he traveled south to Cheonjeongsa Temple in the Chungcheong Hills, a smaller and quieter place than Donghaksa, tucked against a forested slope where the birds made their ordinary announcements at dawn as though nothing in the world had ever been lost. And there, in a room no larger than this one, the room you are resting in right now, or nearly, sitting on a simple grass mat, looking at the whitewashed wall with the same eyes that had looked at a stopped cart and a ceramic pot and a column of incense ash waiting to fall. He broke through to what had always been there. The records do not describe what those moments contained. Korean Seon is suspicious of elaborate descriptions of awakening. If you can put it into sentences, the tradition suggests, you have probably put into sentences something other than the thing itself. What the records do say is that when it happened, Gyeonggeo wept. Not from grief this time, from something closer to the feeling of having been away from home for a very long time and finding, in a very quiet room in the mountain spring, that home had never been anywhere else. He returned to teaching after that. He built meditation centers. He gathered students who became the next generation of Korean Seon masters, Mangong, Haewol, Suvol, Hanum, a lineage that carried the fire through the difficult decades of the 20th century and burns in Korea still today. And in his last years, he set down the teacher's role the same way he had once set down the lecturer's role, quietly, without announcement, and became a wanderer in the northern mountains. An old man with no fixed address, teaching village children their letters in exchange for a meal, dying in obscurity in the Hamgyong region in the spring of 1912. No grand ceremony, no gathered disciples, no last words carefully preserved for posterity. But none of that is the story. Really, the story is one wet evening on a mountain road. A man turning off toward shelter and finding instead a village without sound. A ceramic pot on a dead fire. A stick of incense burned to ash, its column still perfectly upright, waiting for the draft from the open door that would finally scatter it. The story is what happens when a person who has known impermanence as a theory meets impermanence as fact and is not destroyed by it. The story is what remains when everything theoretical has been soaked away by rain, and you find, to your own surprise, that something is still there, watching, present, undisturbed, even now, even in the dark, even in the mud. What Gyeongheo found in that ruined village was not what he expected to find. He expected evidence that impermanence is a kind of catastrophe, that it takes and damages and leaves behind only the shape of what was lost. He expected the teaching to devastate him, and in one sense, it did. Every concept he had filed away so carefully came loose in that rain and could not be refiled. But here is what the epidemic village was actually teaching. Though it took months of locked room practice to hear it clearly, impermanence is not a thief. It is a structure. It is the structure of everything, the very shape of conditioned existence, and a man who has not understood this structure is not living freely inside it. He is just lucky that it hasn't surprised him yet. We resist this understanding because we have been taught, quietly, persistently, by the way we are raised and the way our minds naturally work, that the goal of a life is to secure things against change, to build walls thick enough, to hold tightly enough, to love something and make it stay. And when it does not stay, we call that failure. We call it loss. We call it evidence that we were not paying close enough attention, or did not love well enough, or should have built the walls thicker. What if none of that is true? What if impermanence is not the thing working against you, but the very medium in which everything real takes place? The way music requires that each note pass away to make room for the next. The way a conversation requires that each word dissolve into silence before the next can be spoken. The way breath requires the exhale before there can be another inhale. Nothing would exist, nothing at all, if things did not change. The universe is not impermanent, despite being real. It is real because it changes. Every person you have loved, every moment that has mattered, every experience that has left a mark on you, all of it existed because impermanence made room for it. When Gyeongheo sat in that locked room and asked, "What is this? What is this? What is this?" he was not asking a philosophical question. He was asking what in him was actually capable of remaining present with the fact of change. Not the idea of change. The fact of it. The ash that had not scattered. The moment you understand, in the body and not just the mind, that a version of your life has ended. That the ground you thought was permanent was always moving beneath you. Always. And the answer, the one that opened at Cheonjeongsa after months of silent turning, was not a concept at all. It was more like the discovering of a room that had always been there. A room not made of conditioned things. A room with no lock because it has never needed one. Awareness itself. The watching. The thing in you right now that is receiving these words without needing to grasp them. That watching is not endangered by impermanence. It never has been. It never will be. It is the one thing in the structure of your experience that does not move, not because it resists movement, but because it is the still point from which all movement is noticed. The river notices the river flowing. The sky is not disturbed by what passes through it. What is still here when everything theoretical has been washed away by a night of rain? You are watching, resting. Unchanged by the river you are watching. Let that land below thought, not as a concept to hold, but as a recognition already true. And as it settles, feel the breath moving. Feel the body releasing into its own weight. There is nothing here that needs to be held together tonight. Let the shoulders soften. Let the effort of the day dissolve with the exhale. The way a column of ash finally scatters when the draft finds it. Gently, without drama, into the open air. Let the breath be easy now. Let the exhale carry a little more weight than the inhale, like a sigh that has no grief in it. Just release. Notice the soles of your feet, the warmth of them, the way they rest without effort. From Korea's mountains in 1879, we travel now to the banks of an Indian river in the time of the Buddha himself, where a young nobleman with silk-soft feet had tried so hard to be free that he was tearing himself apart. And the Buddha came to him not with a teaching about suffering, but with a question about music. If you drift off before we arrive, that is exactly right. The stories will hold you either way. There is a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You know this exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of trying, of pressing yourself towards something good with so much force that the force itself becomes the problem. Of lying awake in the dark, reviewing everything you should have done differently today, everything you need to do differently tomorrow. The whole long list of improvements you have been managing since. When? Exactly, since you were old enough to understand that there was a gap between who you were and who you were supposed to become. That exhaustion is ancient. The Buddha saw it in the face of a young man sitting alone in a forest, and he walked across a hillside to address it. Not with a doctrine, not with a schedule, with a question about music. The middle way is one of the oldest teachings in the Buddhist tradition, and it is also one of the most misunderstood. We hear it, and we imagine a kind of moderation, a sensible balance between extremes, the sort of advice a reasonable uncle might give, not too much, not too little. Find the comfortable middle. And there is truth in that reading, but it is a surface truth. Underneath it, the teaching is saying something stranger and more radical. It is saying that the very effort you bring to being free can be the thing that makes you unfree. That the grip you use to reach for peace can be the thing that prevents peace from arriving. That a lute string wound too tightly does not make better music. It makes no music at all. The string snaps, or the sound cuts off, or the instrument warps under the strain. The Pali Canon records a moment from the time of the Buddha himself, a young man named Sona Kolavisa, sitting in a forest outside Rajagarh, who had tried so hard to be free that he had walked until his feet bled. And still, the thing he was reaching for would not come. The Buddha came down from Vulture's Peak on the hillside and sat beside him, and what he said that evening is still being said, in one form or another, by every tradition that has understood the first thing about the human mind. But before the teaching, there is the story. And the story begins, as so many good stories do, with a man who had everything. Sona Kolavisa was born in the city of Kampa, in the kingdom of Anga, in the time when the Buddha was still walking the roads of northern India gathering students. His father, Usaba Sethi, was a financier of great wealth, the kind of man whose household was so prosperous that the records say it grew richer still from the moment Sona was conceived, as though the child were a kind of living fortune. Sona was called Sukumala Sona, Sona the Delicate, and the name was exact. His body was like burnished gold. The texts say, a golden complexion so unusual that it became one of his identifying features, a mark people remembered years after meeting him. The soles of his feet had never, in all his childhood and young adulthood, been allowed to touch bare ground. He moved between his father's 3 palaces, one for the hot season, one for the cold season, one for the monsoon rains, on carpeted floors and litter-carried paths, shaded from direct sun by servants holding silk screens, moved from room to room along corridors hung with woven cloth, so his feet never had to meet stone or earth. A young man so carefully insulated from the hardness of the world that he was genuinely famous in the region for this delicacy, not as an eccentricity, but as a mark of his father's enormous prosperity. The softness of Sona was the softness of a household that could afford to keep the world's roughness entirely at bay. On the soles of his feet, fine golden hair had grown, soft as down, curved inward like small ornaments, the feet of a person whose skin had never had reason to harden. He had also, since childhood, played the veena. The veena was a stringed instrument of ancient design, a long-necked lute, its resonating body, a large gourd, lacquered dark, with a second smaller gourd at the other end for balance. The whole instrument longer than a man's arm and requiring a particular posture to hold correctly. In skilled hands, it produced music of extraordinary range and sensitivity, capable of a single sustained note that seemed to hang in the air long after the string had been plucked, capable of cascading runs that moved faster than the ear could quite follow, capable of producing, in its lowest register, a tone that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the room. Sona had learned it early. the way wealthy children learn the things that mark them as cultivated. But somewhere in the learning, it had become more than accomplishment. He played with the understanding that comes only when a person stops trying to be impressive and starts simply listening. Listening to what the string wanted, what the tension was asking for, where the note wanted to resolve. His teachers said he had an instinct for it that could not be taught. He was a musician who understood, in his hands, if not yet in his mind, the fundamental principle of the middle way, that the string held perfectly is held without force. That the music emerges not when the player grips hardest, but when the player is present enough to feel exactly where ease and effort meet, and holds the string precisely there, at the balance point, breathing with it. When King Bimbisara heard about the young man of Kampa, famous for his golden complexion and his impossibly soft feet and his beautiful playing, he sent for him. And Sona came, with 80,000 fellow townspeople in his company, a procession that took some days to arrive at Rajagaha. He came to meet the king. But in Rajagaha, the Buddha was teaching, and before Sona reached the king's hall, he heard the sound of a teaching being given, and he stood at the edge of the crowd and listened. Whatever the Buddha said that day, Sona heard it the way he heard music, not as information to be stored, but as something that changed the internal arrangement of things. He obtained his parents' consent, relinquished the palaces and the litter and the carpeted floors, received ordination, and went to practice in Sitavana, the cool forest, a wilderness grove just outside the city, known as a place for solitary meditation. Here the trouble began. Sitavana was not cool so much as it was public. The grove sat near enough to the city that people came through it constantly. Merchants, pilgrims, the simply curious, anyone who had heard that a young man of famous wealth and golden complexion had become a monk and was meditating alone in the forest. They came to look at him, to pay respects, to ask questions, to simply stand nearby and feel that they had encountered something holy. And Sona, who had been accustomed all his life to a kind of ordered privacy within his father's palaces, found that he could not concentrate. He tried harder. This is the thing about a person who has learned anything deeply. When it stops working, the first instinct is to apply more of what worked before. Sona had spent years developing the discipline of a musician, the sustained focus required to hold a difficult passage perfectly through a long performance, the capacity to repeat a phrase 50 times without letting attention wander from the exact quality of the fingertips' touch on the string. He knew how to work. He knew how to push through resistance. These were real skills, earned through real practice. And when concentration refused to come in the Sitavana forest, he brought every one of those skills to bear on the problem. He extended his walking meditation hours. The formal practice of walking back and forth on a measured path, feet placed carefully, full attention on the sensation of movement, was meant to be a complement to sitting practice, a way to bring mindfulness into the body's motion. Sona turned it into an endurance task. He walked before dawn, when the air in the forest was cool and smelled of night-damp leaves and the distant smoke of the city's morning fires. He walked through the middle heat of the day, when the light came through the canopy in hard, slanted shafts, and the ground under his feet was warm through his thin robes. He walked in the evening, when the light went golden, and the birds became loud, and the forest filled with the sounds of things settling into night. He walked in the dark. His feet, which had never touched bare ground, began to blister after the first few days. He did not stop. The blisters swelled and he pressed down on them with each step and he walked through the swelling. They opened in the heat, and the raw skin underneath met the ground with a sting that traveled all the way up his legs on each footfall, and he walked through the opening. He had a musician's tolerance for the discomfort of discipline, the cramped hand, the aching back, the hours of sustained repetition that asked the body to cooperate past the point where it would naturally prefer to stop. He applied that tolerance here. He told himself that the sores were evidence of effort, and that effort would eventually yield what he was reaching for. The texts say, with the matter-of-fact simplicity of the Pali style, which does not pause for drama, that the walking path became covered with his blood, like a floor of a slaughterhouse. He walked back and forth on his own blood in the Sitavana forest, pressing forward with the absolute conviction that more effort was what was required, and still the thing he was reaching for would not come. He sat down on the earth one evening, his feet wrapped in whatever cloth he could find, and let himself think the thought he had been refusing to think for weeks. He would go back to Kampa. He would return to his father's house, or not exactly his father's house, since he had renounced claim to it, but to lay life to the doing of good works with his family's wealth, to a way of being in the world that did not require him to destroy himself by inches in a public forest. He had given this his full effort. His full effort had not been enough. He was not the right kind of person for this. His body was wrong for it, too soft, too sheltered, built for the carpeted corridor and the seasonal palace, not for the packed earth of a forest meditation path. He sat with this thought for a long time. It felt not like defeat exactly, but like clarity, the specific relief of a person who has finally allowed themselves to name the situation honestly. On Vulture's Peak, above the city, the Buddha became aware of Sona's state of mind. The texts say this simply, without explanation, became aware, as a teacher sometimes becomes aware of a student in exactly the right kind of trouble. He came down from the peak, through the city and out to the Sitavana grove, and found Sona sitting on the forest floor in the gathering dark. He sat beside him. He looked at the bloodied earth of the walking path. He looked at Sona's feet, and he said, "Before you left home, Sona, you used to play the veena." Sona said yes. The Buddha said, "When the strings of your veena were wound too tight, was the music good?" Sona said no. The sound was wrong. Forced. Cut off. A tightness in it that came through in every note. A sound that had pressure in it where there should have been resonance. He had heard musicians play that way. Good musicians. Technically skilled musicians who were trying too hard, whose wanting it to be beautiful actually prevented the beauty. You could hear the effort in every phrase. The Buddha said, "And when the strings were too slack?" Sona said no again. The sound was muddy, lost, going nowhere. A note that dropped before it was meant to, that had no direction in it, that could not sustain itself across the space between the player and the listener. A kind of disappearing. And the Buddha said, "Then tell me, when does the music come?" Sona was quiet for a moment. He knew the answer the way he knew his own hands. Not from thinking about it, from having done it 10,000 times, since he was a small boy in his father's house. The music came when the string was neither too tight nor too slack, when the tension was held, not gripped, when the effort was present. He was not pretending effort was not required. It absolutely was required, but the effort was calibrated to what the string was asking for, not to what the player's anxiety was demanding. When the musician had learned to listen more than to force, when the wanting it to be good had quieted enough that the goodness could come through on its own, he held that understanding between them in the cooling evening air of the Sitavana forest, the last birds calling in the canopy above, the city a distant murmur beyond the trees. The Buddha said nothing further. He did not need to. What Sona heard in the silence that followed was not a correction. It was a recognition, the feeling of understanding something that had always been true, that he had in fact known in a completely different context for most of his life, that had simply never been applied to this particular question. He had spent weeks tearing himself apart, trying to force freedom to arrive. And freedom, it turned out, was not the kind of thing that came when summoned by force. It came the way music came, when the conditions were exactly right, and the hand was present, but not gripping, and the string was held at exactly the tension it had been asking for all along. He stayed in the Sitavana forest. He adjusted his practice. He did not walk himself to bleeding again. He walked with the attention of a musician listening to the instrument, present, responsive, neither forcing nor abandoning. And the records of the Theragatha say that he attained what he had been reaching for, and that afterward he recited verses on the matter of impermanence that monks were still memorizing centuries after his death. His ruined feet, once healed, were permitted sandals. The Buddha, in fact, amended the monastic rules after Sona's story became known, making clear that sandals were permitted for monks whose feet required them. Sona Kolivisa, Sukumala Sona, the delicate, is recorded in the Anguttara Nikaya as the monk foremost among those who arouse energy, not the monk who tries hardest. The monk who understands how effort actually works, what the lute string knows, and what Sona had to learn by bleeding, is something that sits underneath every experience of impermanence you have ever had. When we resist change, when something ends, or shifts, or fails to stay as it was, and we push back against that movement with everything we have, we are winding the string too tight. We are doing exactly what Sona did on that forest path, applying force to something that does not yield to force, pressing harder in the hope that harder is the answer, walking back and forth on the evidence of our own effort and calling the failure a lack of sufficient trying. Think of the last time something changed that you did not want to change, a relationship that shifted, a job that ended, a version of yourself that you worked very hard to maintain and then could not. What did you do with the energy of not wanting it to change? Most of us do what Sona did. We apply it. We push back. We make plans and contingencies, and we rehearse arguments in our minds, and we lie awake running through everything we should have done differently. And all of this activity, all of this intense, disciplined effort, produces the same result Sona produced on the Sitavana walking path, a great deal of evidence of trying, and not 1 inch of forward movement. The string wound too tight does not make music. It silences itself. The second thing the Vina is teaching, the thing underneath the teaching about effort, is about the nature of the string itself. A string under the right tension is not static. It vibrates. It responds. It is alive to the smallest change in touch, the smallest variation in temperature and humidity in the room. A perfectly tuned string does not hold its tuning forever. It needs constant small adjustments, not because it is broken or failing, but because that is simply what a living string does in a living world. This is anicca made audible. This is impermanence, not as catastrophe but as the condition of music. If the string could never change, it could never sing. Your life is not failing to be permanent. It is succeeding at being alive. Feel the breath moving now. The natural rise of the inhale, the natural fall of the exhale. Not forced, not abandoned, held at exactly the tension breath has always known. This is the middle way in the body. This is the string at the right tension. Let the hands rest. Let the day's effort dissolve with the exhale. You do not need to keep walking the path tonight. The music you are waiting for does not come from walking harder. It comes when the grip finally loosens, and the string is allowed to find the place it has been asking for all along. Let the breath be slow and unforced. Let the next exhale carry a little more out than the inhale brought in, not because you are trying to relax, but because relaxation is what remains when trying stops. Notice the weight of your hands, the quiet there, the way they rest without needing to hold anything. We travel now from the forest outside Rajagaha, from a musician's bruised and healing feet, forward through time to the highlands of Tibet, where a former physician named Gampopa arrived at a cave in the mountains, grieving his dead wife, looking for a teacher who might tell him why sorrow does not behave the way impermanence says it should. And what he found there was not comfort. It was something more useful than comfort. You don't need to stay awake to hear it. Let the body rest into whatever is here. Somewhere in the geography of grief, there is a room most people do not talk about. Not the room of fresh loss, where everything is vivid and terrible, and the world has the quality of broken glass. That room is known. People expect to pass through it. They bring casseroles and they sit beside you, and they say things that help or do not help. And eventually, everyone promises this. Eventually, you move through. But there is another room. The room you enter 6 months later, or a year later, or 3 years later, when the casseroles are long gone and people have quietly stopped expecting you to still be somewhere in the geography of that loss. The room where grief has gone quiet and underground and become something else. A kind of question the mind circles around without being able to name it directly. The question underneath grief, which is not about the person who is gone, but about impermanence itself. About the fact that a body that was here is now not here. About what that means for every body that is here, including yours, including the one you are resting in right now. This is the room Gampopa lived in for 7 years before he found his teacher. Every Buddhist tradition has its way of approaching what the Pali texts call kaya gata sati, mindfulness of the body. The phrase translates as something like bringing full awareness to what the body actually is, including its nature as a changing, temporary, borrowed from the elements thing that will one day return everything it borrowed. In the Tibetan Kagyu tradition, this practice is not introduced as a morbid exercise. It is introduced as a doorway, specifically, as the doorway that grief can become. If grief is allowed to complete its full teaching rather than being interrupted or managed into silence. The Kagyu lineage that runs from Tilopa to Naropa to Marpa to Milarepa to Gampopa is, at its root, a lineage of people who met impermanence directly rather than theoretically. Tilopa, the Indian Mahasiddha who founded the lineage, received his first transmission sitting in a charnel ground. Marpa, the Tibetan translator who carried the teachings north, watched his beloved son die and used that grief as fuel. Milarepa himself, the wild mountain yogi with green-tinged skin from years of living on boiled nettles, said it plainly, "I fled to the mountains through fear of death, where I realized the absolute true nature of mind. Now, even if death comes to me, I will not be afraid." And then Milarepa received a student who knew grief the way a physician knows illness, from the inside. Gampopa Sonam Rinchen was born in 1079 inches, the Niel Valley of central Tibet, in a region of high grassland and cold, clear rivers, where the air in autumn tasted of frost and distance. His father was not a nobleman or a merchant. He was a man of medicine, and the son followed the father. Gampopa trained as a physician in the traditional Tibetan medical system, which understood the body as a system of winds and channels and humors, a living map of interdependence. Nothing in it fixed. Nothing in it separate from everything else. He was good at this work. He had the quality that the best healers have, a capacity to sit with a sick person and be fully present with the sickness without being undone by it. He could look at what was wrong and think clearly about what might help. He married young, as was ordinary in his time and place. The records do not preserve his wife's name. What they preserve is the quality of the life they built together, a physician and his household in the Tibetan highlands. Children born, a practice growing, the ordinary texture of a life that felt like it had found its shape and intended to hold it. He would have known every face in the valley who had what ailment, whose joints ached in the cold months, whose children ran fevers that needed watching. A physician in that country and era was not a person you visited. He was woven into the fabric of the place. He knew where the medicinal herbs grew on which slopes. He knew the taste of water from different springs. He knew what the color of a person's skin told him before they had finished describing their symptoms. This was the world he lived inside, specific, known, held together by his daily attention. 2 children, then his wife. The epidemic moved through the valley when Gampopa was approximately 25 years old. The records do not name the disease, only its passage and its toll. He would have watched it arrive the way a physician watches any approaching illness, with the clinical attention of someone who needs to understand it in order to act. He would have tried to act. He was a good doctor, by all accounts, a skilled one. And this would have mattered enormously to him, the belief that understanding leads to intervention, that careful application of the right knowledge produces the right result. He watched the children first, then his wife, in the bed they had shared through the high, cold winters of the highlands, the fire burning low in the room, the smell of the medicinal smoke he had prepared, doing everything it could do, which was not enough. He found himself sitting with a loss for which his training offered nothing. He could not diagnose it and prescribe it and watch it resolve. The house was the same. The instruments of his work were the same. The valley outside the door was the same cold and the same frost-burnt grass and the same peaks that had always been there. What was gone was simply gone, and no amount of knowledge told him what to do about that. His wife, in the last days of her illness, looked at him from the bed where she was dying and asked him something that had nothing to do with medicine. She asked him not to remarry. Not out of jealousy, the records are clear on this, but because she understood him better than he understood himself. She knew that if he turned toward another household, he would spend the rest of his life in the same beautiful, useful, temporary arrangement, and never be pushed past the edge of it into the question that her death was already asking. He promised her that his only attachment was to the Dharma. She died. He kept his promise. He was ordained a monk at 25 or 26, receiving the name Sonam Rinchen, Gem of Merit. He traveled to study under the Kadampa teachers who preserved the tradition of Atisha, the great Indian master who had brought a systematic path to Tibet 2 generations earlier. These were rigorous teachers, scholarly and precise. They assigned him to meditate on impermanence and death, exactly the subject that his own life had made impossible to ignore, and he did so, with a thoroughness that surprised even himself. But something unexpected happened. The more deeply he meditated on impermanence, the more his earlier experiences of meditation, the states of bliss and clarity he had sometimes touched in sitting practice, became less available to him. The Kadampa commentaries describe this phenomenon with clinical precision. As the meditator moves more fully into the contemplation of death and change, the superficial consolations of practice tend to fall away. What remains is something deeper, but initially less comfortable. Sadness and renunciation, the records note, rather than bliss and clarity. Gampopa was not comfortable with this. He had exchanged one household for another, the monastery, and he had exchanged the grief of a specific loss for the more generalized grief of understanding that all things were like his wife and children, present, beloved, and not to be kept. He had done everything correctly. He had followed the instructions. The sadness did not leave. He was 32 years old and studying diligently and deeply unhappy in a way that he could not quite name when he overheard a conversation that changed the direction of his life. 3 beggars were talking in a doorway. He was passing. He heard the name Milarepa. The beggars were describing the yogi who lived in the mountains to the north, a man of extraordinary realization, a man who had gone to the caves through fear of death and come back from them without fear. The way the beggars said the name was enough. Gampopa felt what the biographies call an overwhelming surge of devotion, which is perhaps the Tibetan tradition's way of describing the specific feeling of recognizing something you have been looking for without knowing what it was. He asked his Kadampa teachers if he should go. They were honest men. They told him they could give him perhaps another 10% in terms of realization. Milarepa, they said, could give him the rest. Go. The journey was long and difficult. Mountain passes at high altitude, rivers that ran cold even in the summer months, paths that required a person to trust the path more than they could see of it. He arrived at Trode Tashigang, the place where Milarepa lived with his circle of students in caves and rough stone shelters above the valley floor. The valley itself was wide and open, the sky enormous above it in the way Tibetan skies are enormous, a blue so deep it seems to have no ceiling. He could see the cave openings in the cliff face from below. He could see smoke rising from one of them. Milarepa's disciples came down to meet him. They received him respectfully. Here was an ordained monk, clearly educated, clearly sincere, offering gold dust as was appropriate. They told him the teacher would see him, but Milarepa made him wait for 2 weeks. The accounts say this was because of Gampopa's pride, not an arrogant pride, not the pride of a man who thought he was better than others, but the subtler pride of a man who had worked very hard and knew it. A monk, a scholar, a meditator who had done everything correctly for 7 years. He arrived at Milarepa's cave, carrying all of that the way a person carries a well-packed bag, efficiently, unconsciously, certain that the bag was simply what you traveled with. The 2 weeks of waiting were their own teaching. They were asking, can you set down the bag? Can you arrive without your credentials? Can you be here, in this valley, at the foot of this cliff, with no students of your own and nothing accomplished except the grief and the practice and the 7 years of trying? Can you be simply here, without the careful identity you have assembled around the loss? On the morning Milarepa finally called for him, Gampopa entered the cave. The space inside was small and dark after the bright valley light outside. There was a low stone table. There were other students along the walls. There was a man, small, weathered, with a complexion darkened by years of high-altitude sun and wind, sitting cross-legged, entirely at ease, as though the cave were the most ordinary and comfortable place imaginable, which for him it was. He offered gold dust. As was customary, Milarepa received it, threw a handful of it into the air toward the sky, with a declaration of offering to his own teacher Marpa, and then, with the unpredictability that was apparently characteristic of the man, picked up a skull cup that had been sitting on the low table before him, filled to the brim with chang, the strong fermented barley drink of the Tibetan highlands. He handed it to Gampopa, a skull cup of alcohol, offered by a yogi to a fully ordained monk, in front of other students, with complete clarity of intent. Gampopa was a man who had kept his vows carefully for 7 years. He looked at the cup. He looked at Milarepa. Milarepa said, "Do not think so much. Drink what I give to you." There was a moment, the records preserve it, in which Gampopa held the cup and sat at the edge of his training and his caution and his 7 years of correct behavior, and felt underneath all of it the question that his wife's death had been asking since the beginning. What is this life actually for? What is the correct response to a world in which the people you love can be taken between one season and the next? Is the answer more careful adherence to more careful rules? Or is it something else? Something that requires setting down the careful, the correct, the preserved, and opening to whatever is actually being offered? He drank. Milarepa asked his name. Gampopa said, "Sonam Rinchen, Gem of Merit," the name his Kadampa master had given him, and Milarepa received him as a son. What followed was years of practice under the most demanding teacher in Tibet, years of sitting and walking and going deeper into the territory that the Kadampa meditation on impermanence had opened up, but now with a guide who had made that same journey without a map. Milarepa taught through everything, through the formal teachings he gave, through the songs he sang about the shattered cooking pot that became his teacher in the moment it broke, through the way he lived, with almost nothing in a cave above the valley, and seemed genuinely free in that nothing. He taught Gampopa that the body's impermanence is not the obstacle to peace. It is the instruction. The body changes. The body ages. The body is taken. Sometimes suddenly, sometimes slowly, sometimes in ways that make no sense to those left standing. And every one of those changes is the same teaching that Milarepa received in the mountains through fear of death, the same teaching that the broken pot offered up, the same teaching that Gampopa's wife had been giving him since the day she died, that what you are most essentially is not the form. The form is the teaching. The form is the Lama. As Milarepa sang, It becomes your teacher in the moment it breaks. Teaching impermanence. How amazing. Gampopa went on to found the Dakla Gampo Monastery, to write the jewel ornament of liberation, to teach the first Karmapa, Dosum Kiempa, and to become the figure through whom the Kagyu lineage transitioned from solitary mountain yogins to an institutional tradition that could carry the teachings across centuries. He died in 1153, in his 70s, at the monastery he had built. The records say he was peaceful. The records say he had understood, finally and completely, what his wife had been trying to tell him from the bed where she was dying, that no arrangement of life, however beautiful, however carefully made, however beloved, can serve as a substitute for the understanding that all arrangements are temporary, and that the understanding of their temporariness is not a wound in the life. It is the life's deepest gift. What Gampopa lived for 7 years in the monastery, that underground sadness, that quiet grief that would not resolve, is something many of us carry without a name for it. It is not always about a person who has died. Sometimes it is about a version of life that has ended, a marriage, a job, a place, a way of being in yourself that you cannot quite access anymore. Sometimes it is about the body itself, which is changing in ways you notice more and more. An ache that was not there last year. A face in the mirror that is slightly less familiar than it was. A sense that the body has its own timeline and is following it regardless of your preferences in the matter. Sometimes the grief is not even that specific. It is simply the awareness, the low, persistent, background awareness that everything you love is temporary, and that you have not yet found the way to hold that awareness without it becoming a kind of weight. The Kadampa teachers gave Gampopa what they could, the correct contemplation of impermanence, the correct understanding of death, the correct view of the body as a borrowed arrangement of elements that will return what they borrowed. It was all true. It was not enough, because what he needed was not better information about impermanence. He had more than enough information. He had watched it take his entire household, but a different relationship to the information he already had. What Milarepa offered with the skull cup was not a theology. It was a gesture. Stop thinking so much. Drink what is being given to you. Stop cataloging your grief and your correct understanding of your grief and your correct behavior in response to your grief, and simply be here, in this cave, with this teacher, holding this cup, alive in this strange, impermanent body that is still, against all odds, breathing. That is the teaching. Not that grief is wrong. Not that the body's impermanence is something to rise above, but that the awareness which is present even in grief, even in loss, even in the cave of the thing you cannot fix, that awareness is not subject to the epidemic. It was here before the loss. It is here in the middle of it. It will be here when everything else has changed again. Feel that now. The breath moving through a body that is resting, that is safe, that is here. Let the awareness that is reading these words, the quiet noticing underneath the words, simply rest in itself, not holding anything, not managing anything, just here, the way Milarepa was in the mountain cave, through all the fear and cold and years, simply here. The grief you carry, if you carry it tonight, it is allowed to be here. It does not need to be resolved by morning. Let it rest alongside you, the way a companion rests beside you in the dark. It knows the way. It has been trying to show you something since it arrived. You don't need to stay awake to receive it. Let the exhale lengthen. Let the next breath come on its own, without being called. Feel the chest, the warmth there, the way the ribs expand and contract without any effort on your part, the body doing what it knows, without instruction, without interference. From Tibet's highlands in the 12th century, we travel now further south and much further west in time, to the river deltas of northern Vietnam, where a king who had defeated 2 Mongol invasions, who had held a kingdom together through war and plague and enormous loss, reached the end of his greatest victory and did something that no one around him could understand. He gave it all away, on purpose, in the full height of his power, and walked alone up a mountain. If sleep finds you before we arrive, let it. You'll understand why he walked when morning comes. There is a particular kind of suffering that belongs only to people who have won. You would not think winning could contain its own suffering. The world does not usually frame it that way. We are told that what we want, once achieved, will hold. That the thing reached for will stay in the reaching hand. That the life secured will remain secure. And so when it does not, when we find that achieving the thing has only moved the threshold of anxiety rather than dissolved it, when we discover that the kingdom, once won, still has to be defended, still requires everything, still cannot simply be held without cost. We have no name for this. Tran Han Tong had won. He had won twice, against the largest military force in the world. He had won in a way that would be remembered for 700 years. And at the height of that victory, something in him understood, quietly, without drama, that victory was also impermanent. That holding the kingdom would cost exactly what defeating the Mongols had cost. That there was no version of having in which having finally, fully held. And so he did something no one around him could understand. He gave it away. Within the Vietnamese Tien tradition, Tien being the Vietnamese form of the same word that becomes Chan in Chinese and Zen in Japanese, there is a teaching about what it means to work with impermanence rather than against it. The Truk Lam school that Tran Nun Tong founded in 1299 on the forested slopes of Yen Tu Mountain was built on a philosophy he called Fat Jiao Nup, the Buddhism that enters into and engages with the secular world. Not Buddhism as withdrawal from life. Not Buddhism as the abandonment of responsibility. But Buddhism as a way of being fully inside life, including its battles and its duties and its loves, while understanding that nothing inside life can serve as a permanent shelter. The Truk Lam teaching on impermanence is unusual because it is not a teaching about loss. It is a teaching about timing, about the difference between being taken from something and choosing to release it, about what becomes possible in a person's life when they stop waiting for impermanence to come and find them, and instead, clearly and willingly, go to meet it. Tran Nan Tong understood this, it seems, from very early. And it took an entire kingdom and 2 wars before he was allowed to act on what he understood. He was born in 1258, in the city of Thang Long, the city that would one day become Hanoi, eldest son of the Tran dynasty king and his queen. He was named Tran Kam at birth. He grew up in the palaces of the Red River Delta, where the air in the rainy season smelled of warm, standing water and the heavy sweetness of lotus blooming in the courtyard pools, where the sound of the river was always present in the background of daily life, where the palace gardens held bamboo groves that moved and whispered in any passing wind. A sound that is nothing like silence and nothing like noise. Something in between that the Vietnamese have always associated with peace. He began studying Buddhism at a young age. Not as state ceremony, the Tran dynasty was Buddhist by culture and custom. And court ceremonies had their Buddhist elements the way all things in the palace had their form, but with genuine, personal attention. He sat with texts. He asked questions of the monks who were brought to court. He noticed, apparently quite early, that the thing the texts were pointing toward was not available inside the palace. By the time he was 16, this understanding had become strong enough to act on. He left the palace at night, alone and on foot, and walked toward Yentu Mountain in the northeast, a day's journey at least, through the flat river delta and up into the forested foothills where the air cooled and the bamboo gave way to older trees. He was trying to reach Hoa Yen Pagoda at the mountain's peak, where he intended to ask the abbot for ordination as a monk. He was found before he reached the summit. Members of the palace guard, sent after him when his absence was discovered, caught up with him on the mountain path and brought him back to Thang Long. The dynasty needed its heir. The kingdom needed its king. He was 16 years old, and he had not yet finished his first attempt at the life he actually wanted. And already the life that had been assigned to him had come to collect him from the path. At 21, he ascended the throne. What followed were 15 years of governing a kingdom that sat in the direct path of the most powerful military force in the world. In 1285, when Tran Nan Tong was 27 years old and had been king for 6 years, Kublai Khan's son, Prince Togun, arrived at the northern border with an army of hundreds of thousands. What followed was not a conventional war. The capital city of Thang Long was deliberately emptied. The king's council burned the food stores, cleared the granaries, and moved the entire civilian population out before the Mongols arrived, leaving the great city hollow and useless to the invaders. For weeks, the Vietnamese court had no fixed capital and no fixed ground. They governed from boats on the rivers and from encampments in the forests. The kingdom functioned as a government in motion, a state without a center, led by a young king who had given up the most visible symbol of his power, the palace, the throne room, the seat. In order to save what the symbol represented, the soldiers of Dai Viet, in those months, had tattooed their arms with the phrase "Death to the Mongols," not as propaganda, as a statement of what they were prepared to offer. The tattoo was personal and permanent, the way a vow is personal and permanent. It was the mark of people who had decided, in their own skin, what this war meant to them. The king, during this period, had considered surrender. The records do not hide this. He was a man who had studied Buddhism since childhood. He understood the cost of violence in a way that pure military commanders may not. He looked at his people, at their hunger, at the long displacement from their homes, at the dead accumulating on both sides, and he said to his general, Tran Hung Dao, that perhaps they should negotiate, that perhaps the cost of continued resistance was higher than the cost of a conditional peace. The general's reply was immediate and absolute. If that is your will, cut my head first. They did not negotiate. They waited. They waited with the patience of people who understood the land and the weather and the rivers and the Mongol army's vulnerabilities in ways the Mongol army did not. They waited until the Mongol supply lines had stretched too thin, and the tropical humidity and heat had done their quiet work, and the guerrilla counterattacks from the riverbanks had accumulated into something the invaders could no longer absorb. Then Tran Hung Dao's forces struck. Within months, the Mongol army was in retreat. The first invasion had failed. 3 years later, they came back. 300,000 soldiers this time. By some accounts, a fleet of 500 ships on the Bakhdang River, carrying supplies for the land army that would move south while the ships maintained the supply line. Tran Hung Dao had spent the 3 years studying the Bakhdang. He had studied its depth at various points. He had studied its tides, the way the water rose and fell by several feet between high and low, the way a ship sitting safely at high tide could find itself in trouble as the water retreated. At night, quietly, over several days before the fleet arrived, his men drove iron-tipped wooden stakes deep into the mud of the riverbed in strategic positions. At high tide, the stakes were invisible beneath the water. At low tide, they broke the surface. A small Vietnamese flotilla drew the Mongol fleet into the river at high tide, skirmished briefly, and then turned and fled north, toward the shallows. The Mongol ships pursued. When the tide began to ebb, the river fell. 400 Mongol ships ran onto the stakes. They were shattered on the points, or captured by Vietnamese forces moving in from the banks, or set alight by fire, arrows that found the disabled vessels one by one. The army on land, cut off from its supply ships, had nothing left to fight with. It retreated north into China and never came back. Kublai Khan died in 1294. The plans for a fourth invasion, which had been forming, died with him. Kublai Khan died in 1294. The plans for a third invasion died with him. And Tran Nhan Tong, 36 years old, king of a country at the absolute peak of its medieval power, the man who had repelled the greatest military force on earth twice in a single decade, looked at his kingdom in the quiet after victory and understood something that his advisors and his court and his people would have found incomprehensible. He had already accomplished the most significant thing available to him in this particular life. He had held the kingdom together through what should have destroyed it. He had made the difficult decisions, including the decision not to surrender when surrender was the easier choice, and those decisions had held. The Mongol Empire would not send another army. Kublai Khan was dead. The Bakhdang River had been staked, the fleet destroyed, the lesson delivered. Dai Viet was safe. What remained, on the other side of all of that, was the long, consuming, necessary work of maintenance. The management of a thing that was now stable but had to remain stable, which required what stability always requires: constant attention, constant adjustment, constant vigilance. The river of governance had to be kept in its banks. The kingdom had to be kept in its shape. And all of this would cost exactly what the war had cost, which was everything. Which was every day of every year for as long as he remained king. He understood. He had understood since he was 16 years old, standing on the path to Yentu before the guards came, that this was not the life he was most essentially suited for, that there was something else he needed to complete, something that the wars had postponed but not cancelled. His son Tran Nhan Tong was ready. The kingdom was as stable as kingdoms ever are. The work that only he could do had been done. He abdicated in 1294. His son, Tran An Tong, became king. Tran An Tong became the supreme emperor, the king father, a ceremonial designation that gave him distance from governance while still allowing the kingdom to locate him if needed. He spent the next 5 years in a kind of middle state, practicing Buddhism, visiting monasteries, moving slowly between the life he was leaving and the one he was moving toward. In 1299, in the 10th month of the year, he left for Yentu Mountain. The records preserved in the Vietnamese royal chronicles describe what this looked like. He left the palace at midnight. He did not take retinue or ceremony or the formal procession that accompanied royal movement during daylight hours. He walked out in the dark, the way he had walked out at 16, except this time no one came to bring him back. On the mountain path in the night, at some point, he threw away the dragon robe, the heavy embroidered silk garment that was the most visible form of imperial authority. The thing you wore to signify that you carried the weight of the kingdom on your body. He threw it somewhere into the dark forest beside the path. The records do not say exactly where. The records have the quality of people who understood that the where was not the important part. He arrived at Hoa Yen Pagoda, the monastery he had been trying to reach since he was 16. The visit interrupted by guards who brought him back to the palace. The journey he had been postponing for 20 years, through 2 wars and a kingdom. He shaved his head at the summit. His Dharma name was Huang Van Dai Dao Da, the great ascetic fragrant cloud. He built a simple hermitage called Nagu Duok at the highest point of the mountain and began to practice. He lived with almost nothing. He sat in meditation in all weather. The records say he remained so still in his long sittings that birds built nests in the folds of his robes, in the warmth of the fabric near his body. He let them. He did not shift or shoo them away. A king who had commanded armies now sat still enough that small birds trusted his stillness the way they trust a tree. He taught and founded the Truc Lam School, and wrote and unified 3 separate Vietnamese Buddhist lineages into the first meditation tradition that was genuinely, wholly Vietnamese in character, not received from China, not imported from India through Chinese transmission, but grown in this particular soil, shaped by this particular history, carrying in its name the sound of the bamboo that grew at the mountain's peak. On the night of November 1st, Itien Sambaling Ba, he knew his death was close. He called a young novice, Bao Sat, to his side at Ngoa Van Pagoda in the cliffs of Yen Tu. He gave what instructions needed, giving. He arranged himself. He died before dawn. The kingdom he had left behind continued. His son governed it well. Kublai Khan's empire, the empire that had arrived at the Bac Dang River with 400 ships, had by then fragmented into succession crises and regional dissolution. The thing Tran Nan Tong had fought to defend was still standing. The thing he had chosen to release, the power, the authority, the dragon robe thrown onto the mountain path, had not damaged it at all. Impermanence had come for both, for the empire and the king alike. The question the Truc Lam teaching poses is not whether impermanence will come, it always comes, but whether we meet it on its schedule or on ours. What Tren Han Tong understood, somewhere in the years after the Battle of Bac Dang, is something most of us understand in glimpses and then quickly cover over again. He understood that the things we work hardest to secure are also the things that will require the most from us to maintain. and that this maintenance never fully ends. Not because the things are not worth securing. He spent 15 years of his life and 2 wars securing his kingdom. And that mattered. It mattered enormously. It mattered for generations. But because maintenance and holding are not the same as freedom, the king who has won the war is not the same as the king who is free. The king who has won the war now has a war he has won, which must be defended, which must be governed, which will cost him the next 15 years and then the 15 after that, in a process that does not have a natural end except the one that impermanence itself provides. At some point, the person doing the holding has to ask, am I holding this? Or is it holding me? Most of us are familiar with the smaller versions of this question. The job you fought hard to get and now cannot imagine leaving. The relationship you built carefully and are afraid to let evolve. The version of yourself, your health, your capabilities, your identity, that you are working to keep fixed while the body and the years keep moving. We hold these things with enormous effort and sincerity, and we call the holding love, or responsibility, or loyalty, or simply necessity. Sometimes it is all of those things. And underneath all of those things, there is the question the Truklam teaching is quietly asking. If you know this cannot be kept indefinitely, what would it mean to release it consciously rather than wait for it to be taken? Tran Nan Tong did not release his responsibility to his kingdom carelessly. He waited until the moment was genuinely right, until his son was ready, until the kingdom was stable, until the work he alone could do had actually been done. The release was not abandonment. It was completion. There is a difference between releasing something because you have given up on it and releasing something because you have genuinely finished with it, because it no longer needs you in the same way. Because you have given it everything you have to give. Because the grip can finally, honestly, open. That kind of release is available to you tonight. Not the release of the things that still need you, but the release of this day, which is complete. The release of tonight's worry, which will still be there in the morning if it is genuinely needed, but which does not need to be held actively in the sleeping hours. The release of the self-monitoring, the planning, the keeping track of, all the forms of maintenance that the mind performs automatically, long after the hour when they can actually accomplish anything. Throw away the dragon robe on the dark path. Just for tonight. Just for these hours. The kingdom will be there in the morning. It always is. Feel the breath now. Slow. Easy. The body finding its own rhythm. Let the exhale be slightly longer than necessary. A small, voluntary release. The way the king let the robe go without ceremony, without announcement, in the dark, on the mountain path, heading somewhere he had been trying to reach for 20 years. Rest is welcome here. It has always been welcome here. Let the awareness settle into the body completely. Feel the weight of it, the specific, particular weight of this body, this night, this room. Soften the jaw, soften the space behind the eyes. We travel now from the mountains of northern Vietnam in the 13th century, from a king who chose his own impermanence, to the rain-soaked forests of Japan, where a monk named Ryokan sat outside his empty hut on a cold autumn night and looked at the moon. A thief had taken everything he owned while he was out. And Ryokan found, to his great surprise, that he felt something very close to gratitude. If you drift off before we arrive, that is perfect. That is exactly right. What if the things you have lost were not taken from you, but given? Not in some forced, consoling way. Not as a spiritual instruction you are supposed to accept whether it feels true or not, but genuinely, as a question worth sitting with on a night when you are lying still and the room is quiet and there is space. Finally, for questions without answers, a monk who lived in a small hut on a Japanese mountain in the early 19th century lost his robe to a thief. He stood outside in the autumn cold, watching the thief disappear down the path, and felt not bitterness, not violation, not even the mild irritation you might feel at an inconvenience. He felt something much stranger. He looked up at the moon hanging over the mountain, and he wished, with complete sincerity, that he could have given the thief that too. The monk's name was Ryokan. The Japanese called him Taigu, the Great Fool. And what he understood about impermanence on that cold autumn night is what this module is carrying toward. Within Japanese Soto Zen, impermanence is not primarily a teaching about loss. It is a teaching about what loss makes possible. The school, founded by Dogen Zenji in the 13th century, which Ryokan practiced from childhood, holds that all things are impermanent, and that this impermanence is not a defect in reality, but its deepest characteristic. Flowers are beautiful precisely because they fall. Tea is perfect precisely because it cools. A moment of genuine connection between two people is worth everything precisely because it will not come again in exactly the same form. But there is a step further than this that the Soto tradition takes, and it is the step that Ryokan lived more completely than almost any other figure in Japanese Buddhist history. If everything is impermanent, then nothing you possess is truly yours to keep. And if nothing is truly yours to keep, then holding it tightly is not protection. It is simply a delay. And delay, the teaching suggests, is not the same as receiving. The hand that grips the robe so hard that it cannot be lifted to the sky is also the hand that cannot feel what the moonlight does to the skin on a cold autumn night. Ryokan spent his life practicing the art of the open hand, and the thief who came to his hut, intending to take, found himself accidentally receiving instead. He was born in 1758 inches, the village of Izumozaki, on the coast of the Sea of Japan, in Echigo province, where the winters come hard off the water and the snow lies deep in the mountain valleys for months at a time. His father, Yamamoto Inan, was simultaneously the village headman, a shipping merchant, a Shinto priest, and a composer of haiku in the tradition of Basho, a man of considerable standing in a prosperous harbor town, whose gold-carrying ships moved between the offshore island of Sado and the capital city of Edo. The prosperity did not last. During Ryokan's childhood, the harbor silted up. Then the family's ship was wrecked in a storm. The business declined. The family that had been at the center of Izumozaki found itself at the edges of it, still present, still the headman's family, but the scaffolding around that status slowly becoming unreliable. Ryokan was the eldest son. At 15, as custom required, he entered his father's business to learn it from the inside. He failed completely. He had the quality of a person whose attention is elsewhere at all times, not from laziness or stupidity, but from a kind of interior absorption that made the ledgers and the negotiations and the necessary social performance of commerce feel not merely difficult, but fundamentally beside the point. The other merchants gave him a nickname, Hiruandon, which translates as a paper lantern burning in daylight, something that produces light at the wrong time. A fool who cannot read the room. At 17, he left the family business and became a novice monk at the local Soto temple, Koshoji. He refused contact with his family from that point forward. Not out of coldness, the records make clear that Ryokan was constitutionally incapable of coldness, but out of some understanding that the life he needed to live was going to require a clean break from the life he was born into. He could not be partly in the temple and partly in the headman's house. He shaved his head and learned to sit, and began the long education that the Soto school offered in its careful, patient way. The study of impermanence through the practice of impermanence, which is to say, through sitting still and watching the breath and noticing that everything the mind produces arises and passes, without exception, without a single exemption for the things you were sure you needed to hold. A few years into his training at Koshoji, a wandering Zen master named Kokusen visited the Niigata region to teach. Ryokan heard him speak once. He asked permission to become Kokusen's disciple on the spot, not with elaborate argument, but with the directness of someone who has recognized the thing they have been looking for and does not intend to let it pass by out of politeness. Kokusen accepted. He was preparing to return to his own monastery at Ensuji. In Tamashima, a journey of over 600 kilometers on foot, from the cold sea coast of Echigo across the mountain spine of Honshu to the warmer, gentler coast of the inland sea. Ryokan walked with him, every step of it. He spent 12 years at Ensuji. They were not easy years in the comfortable sense. The training was rigorous. The winters in Western Japan were their own kind of cold. The daily practice of begging for food required walking the streets of Tamashima with a bowl and an openness to whatever was given or not given, without preference for one outcome over the other. But they were years of extraordinary internal richness. He deepened in calligraphy until the brush became an extension of something that was not quite thought and not quite silence, but somewhere between them. He read Hanshan, the great Chinese mountain hermit poet of the Tang dynasty, whose verses about solitude and cold and simple life spoke to something in Ryokan that the formal Soto doctrinal texts did not quite reach. He sat. Every day, he sat in the early dark before dawn, when the monastery had a quality of held breath. The wood of the floors contracting in the cold, the sound of birds beginning outside the paper screens before the sky lightened enough to see them. The sitting in those years was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. It required the same thing the long walk to Ensuji had required. The willingness to keep going through the point where the part of the mind that wants to be finished says it is finished, and to discover what is on the other side of that point. What Ryokan found on the other side, what Kokusen finally recognized in him and marked with the Inca. The formal seal of acknowledgement was not a grand spiritual achievement that could be described in sentences. It was more like the cessation of a noise that had been running so long he had forgotten it was there. A quieting, an opening. Then Kokusen died. The year after the Inca, the teacher was gone. Ryokan left Ensuji, perhaps because the monastery's direction was shifting under its new leadership in ways that did not suit him. Perhaps simply because the chapter was complete and he was constitutionally a wanderer, and set out with his bowl and his brushes and very little else. He walked for 5 years. He went where his feet went, which is not as improvident a navigation method as it sounds when the feet belong to a person who has learned, over 12 years of sitting, to be genuinely present to what the next moment contains. He slept in temple guest rooms and under the eaves of rural hermitages and occasionally in the open. When the night was warm enough and the stars were available and there was no particular reason to be indoors, he spent time in Tosa Province on Shikoku Island, the island that Japanese pilgrims have circled for centuries visiting the temples of Kobo Daishi, an island with a particular quality of spiritual weight in its landscape. Dark cedar forests and sudden coastline, and the sound of the Pacific audible from the mountain paths on clear days. A traveling scholar named Kondo Banjo encountered him there, in a small hermitage at a mountain's foot. Darkness was falling and rain was beginning when Kondo found the hut. Inside, a thin, pale monk sitting beside a fire that had gone mostly to coals. The monk said, without complaint or appeal for sympathy, that he had no food and no adequate clothing for the cold. Kondo recorded this encounter in his journal with the note that something about the man's manner made the situation feel less pitiable than peaceable, as though the cold and the empty fire were simply the current weather and the monk was in completely appropriate relationship to it. Eventually he returned to Echigo, to the coast of the Sea of Japan, to the landscape of his childhood. His father had died by then. Inan had, in his late years, walked into the sea and drowned himself, having apparently been overtaken by circumstances of mind and spirit that the records do not fully explain. Ryokan inherited the grief of this and the ambiguity of this, and he did not seem to resolve it so much as carry it forward. The way a river carries everything in it while still being a river. He settled on Mount Kugami, north of his hometown, when he was around 40 years old. His hut there was called Gogoan, 5-scoop hut, named for the 5 scoops of rice he collected in his begging bowl on his daily round down to the village below. The hut was small in the way that only matters if you are trying to put more into it than it can hold. 1 room, a sleeping mat, a few scrolls of paper and an inkstone and brushes, a robe, a bowl. The view from the doorway on clear days included the Sea of Japan in the distance, a line of grey-blue that changed color with the weather and the time of day. And in winter, the mountain above the hut was white, and the snow around the hut was white, and the silence that came with that whiteness was the kind that does not feel like absence, but like presence. A very large presence. The presence of winter itself. Sitting outside the door with complete equanimity about whether you were comfortable or not. He lived there for 20 years. What he did there was practice the life he had been preparing for, which looked from the outside like almost nothing but from the inside. It seems from his poems, like everything. He sat in the mornings, before the sky lit up. He walked to the village in the early afternoon with his bowl, and while walking, he composed, not deliberately, not with a notebook and a deliberate intention to record, but in the way that a person who has spent years training perception walks through a world that keeps offering itself as poetry. The pine trees in rain, the smell of the snow, the specific quality of autumn cold on exposed skin, the way the moon looked on a clear night from the mountain path, huge and indifferent and available to anyone who looked up. The children of the village became his companions in a way that the adults found both charming and inexplicable. He would stop on his begging round, and there would be children, and the children would propose a game, hide and seek, snowball throwing, some improvised contest with stones or sticks, and Ryokan would simply join. He did not play with children the way adults play with children, with the slightly performative goodwill of a person doing a kind thing. He played the way children play, entirely. The afternoon would vanish. He would forget the begging rice entirely. He would come home in the dark, empty-handed, except for the memory of the game, and eat whatever he had from the day before, or nothing, and feel that the day had been well spent. And one autumn evening, returning from a walk on the mountain slope through trees that had gone gold and orange in the cooling weeks, he came back to Gogoan and found that the hut had been visited while he was out. There was very little drama to it. The hut had so little in it to begin with that the visitor, a thief, by intention, had found almost nothing worth carrying. What the various accounts preserve, in their slightly different versions, is the essential shape of the encounter. The thief was still present, or barely departing when Ryokan arrived, and Ryokan's response was to consider what he had that he could offer. "You have come a long way to visit me," he said. "You should not return empty-handed." He removed his robe and held it out. The man, bewildered, presumably by the most disorienting response to attempted theft he had ever encountered, took the robe and left. Ryokan stood outside the hut in the autumn cold, in whatever he had left beneath the robe, and looked up at the moon that was hanging over the mountain in a sky that had cleared after the day's clouds. He thought about the thief walking down the mountain path with the robe. He thought about what the man had come looking for and what he had found instead. He thought about the moon above him, how it sat there so completely available, just there, just that light, just that silence, and how it would have been the most valuable thing he could have offered, if only it were his to give. He took out his diary and wrote, "The thief left it behind, the moon at the window." And later he added, apparently as a separate thought on a separate day, or perhaps as an immediate second sentence that the diary format separated, "Poor fellow. I wish I could have given him this beautiful moon." He went inside. He slept. He was not poorer than he had been before the thief came. He was, if anything, slightly lighter. What Ryokan understood, standing outside his hut in the cold with the moonlight on his face, is the heart of what this entire evening has been pointing toward. Impermanence is not something that happens to you. It is not a thief that comes in the night to take what you had hoped to keep. It is the structure of everything, the structure of the robe and the hut and the autumn cold and the moonlight equally. And once you understand this, once the understanding goes below the level of thought and into the level of the hands, the level where the grip either opens or stays closed, then something becomes possible that was not possible before. Generosity. Not the generosity of a person who has enough and gives some away. The generosity of a person who understands that nothing belongs to them in the way they thought, and that this understanding, rather than making them feel impoverished, makes them feel free. The thief came to take the robe. Ryokan gave it. And the difference between those two acts, the taking and the giving, the being stripped and the choosing to offer, is the entire difference that voluntary relationship to impermanence makes. The thief was subject to impermanence. Ryokan was practicing it. The robe left the hut either way, but one of them walked away diminished, and one of them stood in the moonlight, feeling, if anything, grateful. The moon he wished he could have given, that is the teaching pointing at itself. the moon cannot be possessed. It cannot be wrapped in silk and carried in a bundle down a mountain path. It belongs to everyone who looks at it and to no one. It is the most generous thing in the world precisely because it asks nothing in return for its light, keeps nothing back, is entirely available to whoever lifts their eyes in its direction. Your own life is full of moons you have not yet noticed, full of things that are entirely available to you, that ask nothing, that belong to no one, and therefore to everyone. The sound of your own breathing right now, the weight of the blanket, the darkness behind your closed eyes that is not empty but full of the mind at rest, full of awareness, simply present without a task. These things are not lesser because they are simple. They are greater precisely because they cannot be taken. The breath is yours and not yours simultaneously. It belongs to no one and is available to everyone. The awareness behind your closed eyes right now is the same awareness that stood outside Ryokan's hut in the cold and looked at the moon. It has never been diminished by anything that was taken from it. It cannot be. It is the space in which taking and giving both happen, unchanged by either. Let the shoulders soften. Let the hands open, not because you are releasing something, but because there is nothing that needs to be gripped right now. Let the breath be easy, the way moonlight is easy, arriving without effort, departing without reluctance. The thief left it behind. It is here. It has always been here. Let the next exhale carry just a little more than the inhale brought in. A quiet surplus. A small gift to the night. Notice the space behind the sternum, the warmth there, the way it rises and falls without instruction. From the mountain hut on Kugami in northern Japan, we travel now east across the Bay of Bengal and a century further back to colonial Burma, to the monsoon season, to a meditation hall where a woman named Ma H-Twe sat alone through a night of rain and discovered that even fear does not last. Even fear is impermanent, and that this is not a consolation. It is a liberation. If sleep has found you already, good. The discovery will wait. There is a particular kind of fear that visits in the night. Not the fear of a specific threat. That fear has a clear object, to a direction to face, something concrete to respond to. This is a different kind. The fear that arrives after midnight when the room is dark and the ordinary structures of the day have dissolved, and the mind is left with nothing to hold on to except its own activity, which is, at that hour, not comforting. The reviewing, the anticipating, the low hum of unease that does not attach to one thing but floats, attaches briefly to this and then to that, finds new objects as quickly as old ones are resolved, seems sometimes to be looking not for a solution but for permission to simply be present. Most of us handle this fear by managing it, by thinking harder, by planning, by reaching for the phone or the light or anything that will interrupt the loop. And this works. In the way that interrupting something works, the loop pauses, the fear retreats, and you are left in the temporary quiet of a mind that has been distracted from itself but has not actually changed. There is another approach. It is older than the distraction, and a woman named Ma H-Twe discovered it alone in a meditation hall in Rangoon during a monsoon night in the 1950s, when the rain was making it impossible to sleep and the fear arrived anyway. and she did not turn away. The noting practice developed by Mahasi Sayadaw is, at its most essential, a method for applying the understanding of impermanence to experience in real time. Mahasi Sayadaw, born Yusobana Mahadera in 1904 in Upper Burma, and brought to Rangoon in 1947 by the Prime Minister, U Nu, to lead a new lay meditation center, understood that the traditional teaching of Anicca had a gap in it, as it was usually transmitted. People heard the teaching. They understood it intellectually. And then they went home and experienced their fear and their grief and their anger as though these were permanent, solid, fixed realities rather than events arising and passing in the stream of consciousness. Moment by moment, faster than thought can follow. The noting practice was designed to close this gap, not by explaining impermanence better, but by creating the conditions in which impermanence could be witnessed directly. The meditator sits. She places attention on the abdomen, the physical sensation of the breath moving the belly, rising and falling, rising and falling. She notes each movement silently in the mind, rising, falling, rising, falling. When a thought arises, she notes it, thinking. When pain arises in the body, she notes it, pain, pain. When sound arrives from outside, she notes, hearing, hearing. And each thing that is noted without exception, without a single exemption, is observed to arise and then to pass. Nothing lasts, not even the fear. The Mahasi Center opened in 1950 on Sasana Yektha Road in Bahan Township, 20 acres of garden land on the edge of the city, a complex of more than 100 buildings for monks, nuns, and lay people, men and women equally welcome. By the mid-1950s, hundreds of meditators practiced there daily. Among them were many Burmese laywomen, mothers, merchants' wives, teachers, market traders, who came to the center during the monsoon retreat months of July through October, when the rains made outdoor life difficult, and the tradition of intensified practice during the rains retreat made such concentration both appropriate and supported. Ma Heitui was one of them. She came from a neighborhood in northern Rangoon, a part of the city that had rebuilt itself in the decade since the war. The Japanese occupation and the Allied bombing had left damage that was still visible in certain corners of certain streets. But the city was alive again. The markets were full again. The smell of jasmine garlands at the pagoda gates had returned, and the sound of temple bells carried across the rooftops in the early morning the way it always had. Ma Heitui was in her middle years, a woman who had managed a household through the occupation and through the upheaval of independence and through the ordinary, unremarkable difficulty of keeping a family together in a city that kept changing faster than any of them had anticipated. She wore her hair pulled back and her longyi in the deep green she had always preferred. She had the hands of a person who had worked with them her whole life, capable, slightly calloused, quick when they needed to be quick, and very still when stillness was required. She had been a lay Buddhist her entire life, offerings at the pagoda, merit-making, the kind of background devotion that runs through Burmese life, the way rivers run through the delta, always present, always moving, not always consciously attended to. She had heard of the Mahasi Center the way you hear of things in a neighborhood, gradually, through conversation, through a cousin who had practiced there and spoken of it in a way that was difficult to dismiss. She enrolled for the 2-week intensive during the monsoon retreat. The center issued meditators a white jacket to wear over the long yi and a brown sash. She left her own deep green long yi folded in her room and put on the center's clothing, which she found, somewhat to her surprise, to be less a loss than a relief. In the center, she was not a specific person, from a specific neighborhood with a specific son and a specific set of unfinished conversations. She was a meditator. That was sufficient. The center's schedule was exact and uncompromising. Wake at 4 in the morning, to begin sitting by 4:30. Alternate sitting and walking meditation through the day in sessions of roughly 45 minutes to an hour, with breaks only for 2 simple meals taken before noon. No talking beyond what was functionally necessary. No reading. No writing. No conversation that was not directly about the practice. The schedule ran until 9 at night. Then sleep. In a small individual room that smelled of fresh timber and the particular heaviness that the Rangoon monsoon pressed into every surface between July and October. A dampness that was not unpleasant, but that made everything slightly more present to the senses. The wood of the walls, the cotton of the mat, the night air coming through the window screen, carrying the smell of the garden and the wet earth beyond it. The instructions Mahasi Sayadaw gave to each new batch of meditators were recorded and played by tape in the initiation hall, a technical innovation for the era that allowed the precise language to remain consistent even as the Bokken number of students grew into the hundreds. The instructions were practical and specific, with the quality of something tested over years of teaching. Place attention on the abdomen. Feel the physical sensation of the breath moving the belly outward and then inward. When the belly rises, note silently in the mind, rising. When it falls, falling, rising, falling, rising, falling. Not as words to chant, but as bare labels applied to what the body is actually doing. Gently directing attention toward this, instead of toward the thoughts and plans and rehearsals the mind would prefer to be occupied with. When a thought arises, note it. Thinking, do not follow it. Do not engage its content. Do not evaluate whether it is important or trivial. Simply note it and return. When pain arises in the knees or the back from the sitting posture, pain. When sound arrives from outside, hearing. When any mental or physical event enters the field of awareness, name it. Observe it. Return. Ma Hatway practiced this for the first several days, with the particular effort of someone who is very good at applying herself to tasks and has brought that quality, somewhat too intensely, to something that requires a different relationship to effort entirely. She sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she noted, rising and falling and thinking and hearing, with the diligence of a woman who had managed a household through occupation and independence and the ordinary unremarkable difficulty of years, who knew at the deepest level of her experience that things do not happen unless someone makes them happen. The noting practice does not work this way. This was the first necessary discovery. By the third day, her knees ached with a steady, patient insistence that was itself the practice. She noted it. Pain, pain, and returned to the abdomen. And the pain continued, uncured by having been noted, simply present. By the fourth day, her mind produced, in what felt like an organized campaign, every unresolved conversation she had been meaning to have, every errand list she had left behind when she came to the center, every concern about her son that she had been carrying without quite examining. She noted all of it, thinking, thinking, thinking. She returned. The concerns returned. She noted them again. The practice teacher who conducted daily brief interviews listened to her report and made one small adjustment. "Note more lightly," he said. Not noting to stop the thought, just noting to see it clearly. There is a difference between noting as a tool to make something go away and noting as a way of being completely present with something as it is. Try the second. It was in the second week that the night brought the monsoon at its fullest intensity. She had been lying in her small room for an hour, listening to the rain on the roof. Not rain as she ordinarily understood rain, but rain at the scale the southwest monsoon operates, which is not precipitation but pressure, not falling water, but a steady force, bearing down on every surface from above. The roof of the center held, the walls held, but the sound was complete and surrounding, and underneath the sound was a quality of electrical charge in the air, the kind that arrives before and during the monsoon storms of the delta, that makes the body alert in ways it cannot quite articulate. She could not sleep. She got up from the sleeping mat, put on her white jacket over her long yi, and walked to the main meditation hall. The hall was empty at that hour. The schedule did not begin again until 4:30, and it was well past midnight. The wooden floor was cool under her feet. The electric lights in Rangoon at that hour sometimes dimmed and recovered with the demands on the grid, and in the hall, a single lamp gave the space its nighttime character. A large, dim room with sitting cushions arranged in rows. The altar at the far end, with its offerings of flowers and candle stubs, and the smell of incense that had burned during the day and still moved through the air in invisible currents. She sat down on her cushion. She straightened her back. She placed her hands in her lap. She began to note. Rising, falling. The rain was loud. She noted, hearing, and then returned to rising and falling. The fear arrived. She would have recognized it, not as a thought or an image, but as a physical event first. A tightening in the chest and a quality of alertness in the muscles that is not quite readiness and not quite alarm, but somewhere between them. The fear of what exactly she could not have said. The fear that lives at the level below specific objects. The background frequency of a person who has survived enough to know that security is not a permanent condition. The fear she had been managing, in one form or another, for years. She noted it. Fear. And then something happened that the practice had been preparing her for, but that could not have been anticipated from the outside. The fear did not resolve. It did not respond to being named. It did not follow the usual arc of managed fear, which builds and then is interrupted and then diminishes. It simply continued, present, fully present. Fear. And she continued noting it. Fear. The way she had been noting, rising and falling and thinking and hearing. Fear. And then, not dramatically, not with any sensation of completion or arrival, it began to shift. Not to resolve. Not to be replaced by peace or understanding or any of the states she had vaguely imagined meditation might deliver. It simply began to become something else. The way any phenomenon becomes something else if you watch it closely enough and long enough without trying to make it stop. It thinned. The chest tightness softened by a small degree. Another thought arose. She noted it, thinking. She returned to the abdomen. Rising, falling, She sat in the hall for most of the rest of that night. The rain lessened toward 3 in the morning and then stopped entirely around 4. The way monsoon rains sometimes stop, abruptly, as though the sky had finished saying what it came to say. The air that followed was clean and cool and smelled of wet earth and growing things. She sat in the clean air until the other meditators began to arrive for the 4:30 sitting. She could not have said, then or later, that she had understood something. That is not quite the right description. It was more that she had watched something, had been present to something that she had previously only known theoretically. The fear had come. It had been fully present. It had been completely real. And then it had passed. The way everything passed. The way the Mahasi instruction said everything passed. The way she had been told impermanence operated, but had not yet felt it operating on something this immediate and personal and visceral. She had read that Mahasi Sayadaw's teacher's teacher had once said of the noting practice, what arises passes away after a short while. That no phenomenon lasts forever. That all phenomena arise and pass away so rapidly they do not last even for the twinkling of an eye. Sitting in the clean air after the monsoon, she understood why a teacher would say something like that. Not as a comfort. As a fact, she completed her retreat at the end of the 2 weeks and returned to her neighborhood in northern Rangoon and to her son and to the conversation she had been needing to have with him. She had that conversation. She also went back to the center the following monsoon season, and the season after that. The fear, when it came, and it continued to come, in the way that fear continues to come through a life, finding new occasions and new objects, continued to pass. Not immediately, not reliably, but consistently enough that she knew, in her body rather than her mind, what the noting practice had shown her on that monsoon night, that fear is not a wall, it is weather, and weather, watched with enough stillness and enough patience, moves through. What Mahastwi discovered in that empty meditation hall, and what Mahasi Sayadaw designed the noting practice to make discoverable, is something about the nature of the difficult emotions that visit us at night. We treat fear and grief and anxiety and the low hum of unease that comes with lying still in the dark as though they were objects, solid things, permanent residents. We try to solve them, to analyze them, to make them stop through the force of understanding or distraction or sheer determination. And because we treat them this way, as problems requiring solutions, we do not notice what they actually are, events. Arising events, the same as rising and falling, the same as hearing and thinking, the same as everything. The noting practice trains the attention to observe. They arise. They are fully present. They pass, not because you made them pass, not because you solved the thing they were pointing at, but because arising and passing is simply what all conditioned phenomena do. Fear is a conditioned phenomenon. Grief is a conditioned phenomenon. The unease that floats through the dark hours, attaching itself to one concern and then another, is a conditioned phenomenon. Every one of them obeys the same law that rising and falling obeys, that hearing obeys, that pain in the knees obeys. They all pass. The noting practice asks only that you stay present to what is arising long enough to notice this, not to stop it, not to improve it, just to witness it, the way Ma H-Tui witnessed the fear in the empty hall, with the rain outside and the single lamp and the cool wooden floor until you see for yourself, in your body rather than your mind, that the thing you were so sure was permanent has already, quietly, begun to shift. Whatever is visiting you tonight, the worry, the restlessness, the mind that will not settle, note it, not with a word necessarily, just with attention, just with the quiet willingness to be present to what is arising, without immediately trying to make it stop or different or better. Let it be here. Watch what it does next. Watch what it does. Let the belly rise and fall. Let the breath be the anchor, not a cure, not an escape, just the simplest available return point. Rising, falling. You do not need to stay awake to continue receiving this. The practice does not require your conscious participation to work. Let the body know what it already knows. Falling, resting, here. The weather that passes leaves something clean and cool behind it. That is always true. It was true when the monsoon stopped over Rangoon at 4 in the morning. It is true right now. Breathe out slowly. Let the next breath come when it comes. Notice the back of the neck, the warmth of it, the slight weight of the head resting into the pillow. From the meditation hall in Rangoon, from the monsoon that passed through and left clean air behind, we travel now into the vast philosophical sky of Dzogchen to the Tibet of the 14th century, where a teacher named Longchenpa sat in a cave above the world and wrote, in the most precise language he could find, about the one thing in the mind that impermanence has never touched. If sleep finds you before we get there, that is more than fine. That is the teaching arriving in its most direct form. What if impermanence is not the deepest thing? We have traveled a long way tonight through that question. Through a plague village, and a forest floor, and a monsoon night, and a mountain cave, and a dark meditation hall. Each story has looked at impermanence from a different angle, as loss, as resistance, as grief, as voluntary release, as generosity, as the nature of even fear. And somewhere in that looking, if you have been listening with the body rather than only the mind, something may have become available that is not quite an idea, a sense of what stays when everything temporary is accounted for, a quiet, a space, something that is present in each of these stories, not as their subject, but as their ground. The awareness that watched Gyongho sit in the mud, that held Gampopa in the cave, that witnessed Ma Hech-Tway in the empty hall while the monsoon passed overhead. The Dzogchen tradition of the Tibetan Nyingma lineage has a name for this ground. It calls it Rigpa, pure awareness, the nature of mind, the one thing in the whole of experience that impermanence has never touched and never will. A man named Longchenpa spent 56 years in that ground and left behind him the clearest description anyone in Tibetan history has written of what it is. The Dzogchen teaching on the nature of mind begins with a question that sounds simple and is not. What is it that watches thoughts arise? Not the thoughts themselves. Not the content of the thoughts, the plans and the worries and the memories and the rehearsals, but the awareness that is present when they appear, the watching, the knowing, the clear, open space in which the thought, I am afraid, or I am not enough, or I need to fix this before I can rest, in which that thought arises the way a cloud arises in the sky, is fully present, and then dissolves. The sky does not dissolve. The sky that the cloud passes through is exactly the same before and after. It has not been diminished by the cloud. It has not been improved by the cloud passing. It simply remains vast, unobstructed, without quality of its own except this quality. It is aware, Longchenpa wrote, from his hermitage on the White Skull Snow Mountain. In the 14th century, it is important to look directly at the nature of thoughts when they arise, not to follow them, not to suppress them, not to judge whether they are good thoughts or bad thoughts, spiritual thoughts or worldly thoughts, to look directly at what is doing the thinking, and in that looking, to discover that what is doing the thinking has never been conditioned, never been damaged, never been made impermanent by the impermanence of what it observes. His teacher's lineage used an image for this that has been passed down through 7 centuries because it is precisely, almost embarrassingly, accurate. When someone throws a stone, a dog chases the stone. Its attention goes entirely to the object that is moving. It follows the stone wherever it goes. It cannot help it. The stone has all of it. But when someone throws a stone at a lion, the lion does not look at the stone at all. The lion turns toward the hand that threw it. And when the lion turns, the person throwing understands immediately that the situation has changed. The dog is the ordinary mind, chasing each thought wherever it goes, pulled from one object to the next, unable to find rest, because rest would require looking away from the stone. The lion is Rigpa, the awareness that turns toward its own source, that looks not at the content of thought, but at what is doing the thinking, and discovers there's something that cannot be thrown at it, something that was not caused and cannot be disturbed. He was born in January 1308 inches, the Tra Valley of southern Tibet, to a father from the Rock clan, himself a tantric yogin and scholar, a man who chanted mantras rather than cultivating fields, whose practice ran through the household the way weather runs through a valley, and a mother from the Drum clan, a lineage with its own distinguished history of Buddhist practice, tracing to one of Tibet's most celebrated teachers. His birth name was Drymosa, stainless light, a name the tradition says was given in recognition of what his teachers recognized in him from the beginning. He received novice ordination at age 12 at Samye Monastery, Tibet's first Buddhist monastery, built in the 8th century on the banks of the Yarlung Tsangpo River at the instruction of the Dharma king Trisong Detsen. Samye was not merely old, it was foundational. Its courtyard had heard Sanskrit texts chanted for 5 centuries. Its walls had absorbed the teachings of Guru Padmasambhava, who had come from India to tame the local spirits that resisted Buddhism and to plant the seed of the Dzogchen lineage in Tibetan soil. Ordaining at Samye was like being received into a tradition that had roots in the Indian subcontinent and the tantric lineages stretching back beyond written history. Longchenpa absorbed this with the appetite of a person who had been hungry for exactly this his whole short life. At 19, he went to Sangpo Nutok, the greatest monastic college in Tibet, where the curriculum centered on logic, epistemology, and the philosophical traditions of Asanga and Dharmakirti, the analytical methods by which Indian Buddhist thinkers had spent a millennium testing the reliability of mind and perception, and the claims consciousness makes about the first world it inhabits. He mastered these methods. His teachers recognized him as exceptional. He was given the designation Samye Lungmangpa, the one from Samye with many transmissions. a title that acknowledged both his origins and the breadth of what he had already received. He became the abbot of Samye. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. A young man in his 20s, abbot of Tibet's most historically significant monastery, the institutional center of the Nyingma tradition, recognized by his peers and seniors as the most learned scholar of his generation. This was the life that was available to him. The life of a presiding scholar, a keeper and transmitter of tradition. A person whose considerable intellectual gifts would be housed in a considerable institution and passed forward through the established channels of monastic education. He left it. Around the age of 20, he resigned the abbotship and went alone into a cave. He spent 8 months in complete darkness, not metaphorical darkness, not the darkness of uncertainty or spiritual confusion, but actual, physical darkness. No lamp, no fire, no opening to the sky. Just the dark and whatever the mind does when it cannot look outward and must turn entirely toward itself. What happens in that darkness to a mind that has memorized the entire Kanjur and Tenjur? The canonical scriptures and commentaries of Tibetan Buddhism, that knows by heart more philosophy and logic and tantra than most scholars encounter in a lifetime. What happens to all of that in 8 months of darkness, in the absence of any object to apply it to, is not something that can be described from the outside. The texts note simply that he emerged from this period with something that had not been available to him before. A quality of directness, a willingness to prioritize experience over explanation that would mark everything he subsequently wrote. When he was about 27 years old, news reached him of a wandering master named Rigdzin Kumaradza, who was moving through the highlands of central Tibet with about 70 disciples, living like nomads, sleeping in coarse sack garments, carrying their practice with them from valley to valley in conditions of real deprivation. Kumaradza was the holder of the Vimala Nyingtik, a lineage of Dzogchen teachings that traced itself directly to the great Indian master Vimalamitra, who had carried it from India to Tibet in the 8th century at the invitation of the Tibetan king Trisong Detsen. Longshenpa went to find him. The night before his arrival, Kumaradza told his assembled disciples that he had dreamed of a divine bird that came with a great flock in attendance and carried away all his texts in every direction. He said this in the way teachers of his tradition said such things, not anxiously, but with the quiet alertness of a person for whom dreams are dispatches from a level of reality that waking life is continuous with. Longchenpa arrived the next day. He had nothing to offer. The customary tribute a student brings to a teacher: gold, goods, offerings appropriate to the occasion, was beyond his means. He was a young man who had left the comfortable institutional position of Samye abbot to wander in search of something he could not yet fully name. He stood before Kumaradza empty-handed, aware of the impropriety of it, prepared for refusal. Kumaradza accepted him. He had already known, through whatever knowing teachers of that lineage possessed, that the arrival was appropriate. And, over the next 2 years, living nomadically in the mountains with Kumaradza's assembly, sleeping in rough conditions, eating whatever was available, Longchenpa received everything Kumaradza had to give. Every teaching, every empowerment, every pith instruction in the Nyingtik lineage. He absorbed them in the way his teachers had absorbed the teachings before him, not only through the intellect, though the intellect was also engaged, but through the direct experience of sitting in the presence of a person who was already in what the teachings were pointing toward, and finding that presence recognizable After Kumaradza's transmission was complete, Longchenpa went into retreat. 3 years of practice in the caves at Chimpu above Samye, the same sacred hillside where, 5 centuries earlier, the great Tibetan translators had worked alongside Indian masters to render the Sanskrit texts into Tibetan. The same slopes where some of the earliest Tibetan Buddhist practitioners had meditated in the open air while Samye was being built below them. The air at Chimpu was cold and thin. The wind off the mountains constant. The silence on windless days absolute in the way that silence is only absolute when it is very high up and you are entirely alone. He practiced for 3 years what Kumaradza had transmitted. Not studying it. Not analyzing it. Not composing commentaries on it. Those would come later. Just sitting in it. Letting the pointing out instructions that Kumaradza had given him do what they were designed to do. Wear away the habit of treating the thinking mind as the totality of mind, until what had always been behind the thinking mind became simply obvious. The way a room becomes obvious once the furniture has been moved out of it. Not a new discovery. A recognition of what had been present all along. He emerged from Chimpu and began to teach. Then began to write. Gangri Tokar, the White Skull Snow Mountain, became his home. The hermitage he established there, he named with a phrase that meant something like, the place of the radiant, activity of the light of Orgian. After Padmasambhava, the master from Odhyana who had planted the Dzogchen seed in Tibet in the first place. The mountain sat northeast of the Tashi Gepal temple in the region of Wangkyangdo. And Longchenpa described it in his own commentary as adorned with a mane of ice and dressed in moon-like whiteness. On clear days, the view from the hermitage would have included the wide valley below, the rivers threading through it, and on the far horizon the peaks of the high Himalaya. He wrote by candlelight. He wrote in the mornings and the evenings and through the nights when the work was moving. He composed in the manner of a person for whom writing was not separate from practice, but continuous with it. The act of finding language for what had become directly available was itself a form of staying in it, a way of mapping the ground so that those who came after might recognize where they were standing. The 7 treasuries emerged from these years. The treasury of the supreme vehicle, the treasury of the way of abiding, the treasury of pith instructions, the treasury of philosophical systems, and the others, over 200 texts in total, covering the Dzogchen, teaching from its historical origins through its philosophical underpinnings to its most direct and practical expression. The trilogy of finding rest. The trilogy of natural ease. Text after text in which the same sky was pointed at from different angles, with different language, for different levels of reader, with the consistent underlying intention of a person who understood that the most important thing he could offer was not more information about the nature of mind, but a more precise set of fingers pointing at it, until the pointing became unnecessary and the looking became its own continuation. He was also exiled during these years. As mentioned, the political friction of a mediating role mishandled. 6 years in Bhutan. Monasteries founded. Children fathered. The teaching continued regardless. He returned. The ruler who had exiled him gave him his permanent name. He went back to Gangri Tokar. He died there in 1364, in his hermitage on the White Skull Mountain, in the month of December, at the age of 56. The texts say that auspicious signs accompanied his death, as they say of teachers in that tradition. Rainbows and lights and the other phenomena that the Nyingma tradition associates with the dissolution of a realized practitioner. What cannot be disputed is the 44 years of writing he left behind. which his student Jigme Lingpa 4 centuries later called the collected works of the most important Nyingma teacher in Tibetan history, and which practitioners around the world still study today in the original Tibetan and in translations that are still, in the 21st century, being completed. What Longchenpa left behind was not doctrine. It was a description of a sky. What Longchenpa spent his life describing is not something separate from what you are experiencing right now. The sky, the awareness that is present in you as you listen to these words, is not produced by this conversation. It was here before the first story began tonight. It has been present through every moment of this evening, through the rain village in Korea, through the forest outside Rajagaha, through the monsoon in Rangoon, not as a concept, as what you were using to take in each of those places. The Dzogchen teaching on impermanence is unusual because it does not end with impermanence. It uses impermanence as a pointer. It looks at the arising and dissolving of thoughts and says, yes, all of this is impermanent. And now, look at what is watching the impermanence. Look at the awareness that is present in the moment before the thought arises, during the thought's arising, and after the thought dissolves. That awareness is the same in all 3 moments. It did not come from the thought. It will not go with the thought. That awareness, Rigpa, the nature of mind, the sky through which the clouds of thought and emotion and sensation and the whole weather of experience pass, has never been made impermanent by what is impermanent within it. It is not protected from impermanence. It simply is not subject to it, in the same way that the sky is not subject to weather. Weather happens in the sky. The sky is not the weather. Right now, tonight, whatever is moving through you, the tiredness, the unresolved concern, the drift towards sleep, the small restlessness, whatever remains of the day, all of it is moving through something. That something is still and spacious and aware. It has been here since before tonight. It will be here when the night ends. It was here before the first thought you can remember having, and it will be here after the last thought you will ever have. You do not need to find it. You are already using it to receive these words. The part of you that understood each sentence in tonight's stories before you could have explained why you understood it, that was Rigpa. The part of you that felt something in the cave with Gampopa and something different in the monsoon hall in Rangoon. The feeling itself is impermanent. What was feeling it is not. The sky through which all weather passes has always been here. Has always been the medium in which your entire experience of your entire life has been occurring. That is what Longchenpa is pointing at. Not something far away or rarefied or available only to 14th century Tibetan masters who spent 8 months in darkness. Something this close. Something this obvious. Once the habit of looking only at the clouds lifts long enough for the sky itself to be noticed. Let the eyes close fully if they have not. Let the face soften, the space between the brows, the jaw, the soft tissue of the throat. Let the body be supported completely by what is beneath it. The thoughts that come now will arise in that awareness and dissolve in it. Let them. You are not the thoughts. You are the awareness that the thoughts occur within. That awareness does not need to sleep because it does not tire. It does not need to resolve the unresolved because it was never troubled by it. Rest in the sky. Let the weather move through. Everything arises. Everything dissolves. The awareness that watches both was never born and will never end. That is what Longchenpa sat with in his cave on the White Skull Mountain for the 56 years of his life. It is what you are resting in right now. Let the breath be very gentle now, almost invisible. A slight rising, a slight falling. Let the awareness that has been listening simply be here, without direction, not listening to anything in particular, not waiting for the next story, just here. From the slopes of Gangri Tokar in 14th century Tibet, we travel now to the kingdom of Bhutan, to a place that Longchenpa himself once walked, where centuries later, a man named Jabdrung Ngawang Namgyal built the great fortress monasteries that still stand, and then, at the height of his power, sealed himself into a small room and let only a small window remain between himself and the world. He did not speak again for many years. If you are already asleep, that is the teaching completing itself. There is a kind of completion that looks, from the outside, like disappearance, not failure, not abandonment, not the retreat of someone who gave up before the work was finished. The retreat of someone who finished the work and then, understanding that no more was required of that particular form, simply stepped back from it, became quiet, let what had been built stand on its own. The day comes for everyone. Eventually, when the thing you have been carrying is ready to carry itself, when the children are old enough, when the project has found its own momentum, when the city you have been building stone by stone has acquired the weight of its own existence and no longer needs you to hold it up, that day does not announce itself loudly. It arrives the way evening arrives, gradually, then completely. The light simply different from what it was, and the quality of the air different, and something in the body knowing that the day's work has been received. Jabdrung Ngawang Namgyal built a nation. He spent 35 years in one of the most mountainous and remote kingdoms on earth, a place of warring valley chiefdoms, of forest paths through high passes, of dzongs being raised, stone by stone, on the bends of rivers where two waters met. And he organized it, governed it, defended it, gave it a legal code and a system of governance and a way of being a country that has lasted 400 years. And then he went into a room at the heart of Punakadzong, on the bank of the confluence of the male river and the female river in the valley below the mountains where the country he had made lay quiet. And he gave the instruction that no one should disturb him. He was never heard from again. He was born in 1594 at Rangoon Monastery in Tibet, into the family that had held the Drukpa Kagyu lineage for generations, the same school of Tibetan Buddhism that ran through the mountain passes between Tibet and the southern valleys, the way snowmelt runs through high drainage, finding lower ground, finding its level, carrying what it carries without effort or intention. His father was Mipam Tenpai Nima, the lineage holder. From the beginning, the boy was recognized as the reincarnation of Pema Karpo, the fourth Gyalwang Drukchen, the most revered master the Drukpa school had produced in living memory. He was, from birth, the continuation of something already very old. He became the 18th abbot of Rangoon. He was brilliant and charismatic and deeply trained, and these qualities, combined with the weight of the lineage he carried and the history of the monastery he presided over, were precisely what made him a threat to the powerful Tsangpa king of central Tibet, who had backed a rival claimant to the Drukpa throne. Theological dispute sharpened into political pressure and then into a threat of arrest. The Changpadesi sent word: surrender the sacred relics of Railung, including the Rangoon Karsapani, a self-emanated image of the Bodhisattva of compassion that had formed in the vertebra of the lineage's founder Tsangpa Gyare, and submit to the rival authority. These were not merely objects. In the understanding of the tradition, they were the lineage made physical, the thread connecting this generation to all the generations before it. To surrender them was to dissolve the lineage into the state's convenience. He would not. In 1616, facing imminent arrest, Ngawang Namgyal received a vision, a raven flying southward, and in the raven the invitation of the guardian deities of a country beyond the passes. He was 22 years old. He wrapped the Rangjung Karsapani carefully for travel, gathered what could be carried, and with a small group of followers began the crossing of the Himalaya into the valleys below. The passes were high and cold in the way that high mountain crossings are cold, a cold that operates at a different level than ordinary winter cold, that enters the bones differently, that the body responds to with a quality of alert endurance rather than simple discomfort. He carried the relic through that cold. The path was steep and exposed. Below the passes, the land opened into the deep forested valleys of what was not yet Bhutan. The blue-green pine forests falling away toward rivers running fast and cold from the glaciers above. The air warming as they descended. The smell of forest and earth after the snowfields of the passes. Birds beginning again after the silence of the high altitude. He arrived in a land that had been waiting. The tradition says, for exactly this arrival. Bhutan, in 1616, was a collection of clan-held valleys, each with its own chieftain or monastery, in varying states of tension with one another. The topography of the place, deep river valleys cut between high ridges, each valley somewhat protected and somewhat isolated by the terrain on either side, had produced a landscape of persistent fragmentation. No one had held it all together. He did not arrive with a plan to hold it together. He arrived as a refugee monk, carrying a sacred relic and a vision of a raven. What he built in the following 35 years emerged from the specific situation of each year, the specific threat and the specific opportunity and the specific quality of his own presence in relation to both. 3 years in retreat at Cherry Monastery first, before anything else. This is the part that must not be passed over too quickly. 3 years of practice before the building began. 3 years in the pine-scented silence at the head of the Thimphu Valley, sitting with what had been carried over the passes, not only the relic, but the loss of the monastery that had held it for generations, the loss of the lineage's institutional home in Tibet, the loss of the specific form in which the tradition had existed up to that moment. 3 years of sitting with that loss, the way Gampopa sat with his, until the sitting itself produced something that was not consolation, but clarity. The understanding of what was actually needed. The capacity to act from that understanding without distortion. What came after was the work of building. He built Cherry Monastery first, in 1620, at the head of the Thimphu Valley, on a slope above the river, where the air in the mornings carried the smell of pine resin and cold water, where the sound of the river running below was present at all hours as a low, continuous note beneath everything else. The monastery was small. 30 monks in the first community he ordained there, the first formal Drukpa monastic order in Bhutan. And before he organized anything, before he built anything else, he spent 3 years in strict retreat within those walls, 3 years of sitting in that pine-scented silence at the head of the valley. 3 years of letting the practice settle in the body the way it settles. Only when everything external has been set aside and there is genuinely nothing to do except be present with what is. He had crossed the Himalayan passes to escape arrest. He had carried a sacred relic through mountain cold that most people in his time never survived crossing. He had arrived in a country that did not yet know it was a country, with no certainty of what would come next. And before doing anything about any of that, he sat down and practiced. This sequencing matters. It is not incidental to the story. What came after those 3 years was the work of a lifetime. Simtocha Jong, built in 1627 at the entrance to the Thimphu Valley, the first of its kind in what he was beginning to imagine as a unified country. A fortress monastery of whitewashed stone, 4 stories high, at a strategic bend in the valley road where the routes from Paro and Trongsa converged. A building that was simultaneously a military fortification, a seat of governance, and a place of practice. The courtyard within held both the administrative chambers and the prayer hall. The smell of incense and the sound of liturgy mingling with the sound of administrative decisions being made in adjacent rooms. It was not a compromise between the sacred and the secular. It was the insistence that the distinction was provisional. In the winters of those years, the passes through which he had escaped, Tibet filled with snow and became impassable, and the valleys of Bhutan were sealed from the north. And in that sealed quiet, the work continued. More monasteries, more monastic rules, more transmissions of the Drukpa, teaching to the monks and nuns and lay people of the valleys who came to receive them. The country's topography, which had previously kept the valleys divided, became the thing that held the new nation together, each valley somewhat protected by its ridges, each tsong built on a strategic bend of a river, each community connected to the others by paths that the locals knew and the invaders did not. Punahadzong, completed in 1638 at the confluence of the Fochu and Mochu rivers, the male river and the female river joining at the point of the building's foundation, became the seat of government, the administrative and spiritual center of what was now unambiguously a unified country. The Dzong's location had the quality of something chosen, not just practically but symbolically. The meeting of 2 rivers, the union of 2 currents. The insistence that administration and devotion were not separate rivers but one. The building was vast and proportioned, and the Rangoon Kasapani relic sat within it, the self-emanated image that had traveled with him over the passes 20 years before, now housed in the place he had built to receive it. 7 times between 1616 and his death, Tibetan military forces crossed the high passes. 7 times the mountain terrain and the defended dzongs and the mobilized valleys turned them back. The country learned, through those repeated defenses, what it was: a place worth defending, a place with a shape, a place that had been made rather than merely found. He established the dual system of governance that still runs through Bhutanese life today: the Je Khenpo, the highest spiritual authority, and the Druk Desi, the secular administrator, 2 parallel streams, neither fully subordinate to the other, requiring negotiation and balance in perpetuity. It was the most architecturally ambitious thing he built, not a dzong, but a system, not walls, but a principle. Something designed to continue after the person who designed it was no longer there to maintain it. In 1651, he was 56 years old. The country stood. The Dzong stood. The lineage was transmitted. The relics were housed. The system was in place. His health had declined over the previous years. He had made trips to the hot springs at Chubu, seeking relief that did not come. He had done what he came to do, which is not a small thing and not a common one, to look at the work clearly and see that it was finished. He went to the Machen Lakhang, a shrine room at the heart of Punakha Dzong, where the sound of the two rivers meeting outside the walls was always present, and gave the instruction that no one should disturb him. He sat in the posture of meditation. His attendants brought offerings to the door. For some time after, they heard the sound of practice continuing within, the faint movement of a person still in the room, the almost imperceptible signs of a presence still present. And then the sounds changed, and then they ceased. What happened in that room is not documented. What the tradition says is that he entered the deepest meditative absorption, the state in which the distinction between practice and death becomes something only those inside the experience can evaluate. What his attendants understood was that the room had become very still, and they made their extraordinary decision. They would not announce it. The country was too new, the succession too uncertain. The external threats still present enough that the weight of his continued name was needed even after the particular form that name referred to had dissolved. For 54 years they kept the secret. Edicts passed through the small window in the shrine room door. Decisions on governance. Responses to petitions. The ongoing administration of a country being issued, apparently from a room in which a man had not moved for decades. No one on the outside was permitted to verify what the inside contained. What the governors knew, they held. The retreat continued. They told the valleys. He was still in retreat. The announcement came in 1705. Zabdrung Ngawang Namgyal had entered Parinirvana in 1611. He had been gone for 54 years. The country he made had been standing on its own, in his silence, for more than half a century, and it had held. His death anniversary, Jabdrung Kucho, falling on the 10th day of the 3rd lunar month, is observed as a national holiday in Bhutan. It is a day of quiet, of prayer, of sitting still in the country he made, and remembering a man who spent 35 years building what he understood and then stepped into a room and let the building stand without him. In the Bhutanese tradition, this final retreat is understood not as death in the ordinary sense, but as the deepest practice, the one that asks nothing more of the practitioner than to release, completely and without remainder, the form that has been used. There is nothing left to understand tonight. You have traveled through 8 voices and 8 centuries and 8 different angles on the same question. The question that Impermanence asks everyone who looks at it directly, which is not a question about loss, but a question about what remains when the thing you thought was permanent proves not to be. None of these 8 voices answered it. That is not what they were for. They were for sitting with it long enough that the grip relaxes, for staying in the presence of the question until the urgency of finding an answer quiets into something more like a breath. What changes across a night like this is not the understanding. What changes is the grip. Jabdrang built a country and walked into a room. The country stood. The room held him. What he carried into that room was not the burden of everything he had made, the zongs, the system, the defended passes, the relic carried over the cold passes from Ralung. He carried nothing into that room. The country was already carrying itself. It had been carrying itself for years. What he entered the room to do was simply to stop the carrying, to let the hands open, to discover what was in the hands when the carrying stopped, which was nothing, and which was everything, and which was the same quality of open awareness that the Dzogchen tradition calls Rigpa, and the Soto tradition calls the moon at the window, and the Korean Seon tradition calls the original face. You can do this now. Tonight. Not permanently. Not with ceremony. Not as a decision that requires your full waking attention to execute. Just for the hours between this breath and morning. Set down what you have been carrying. Not because it doesn't matter. Because it will be there in the morning, and it will be there more clearly, if you let it rest while you rest. The dongs are stronger for the seasons when no one was required to actively defend them. The walls simply stood in the cold and held their own weight. That is enough. That has always been enough. Let the breath be very slow now, slower than necessary. Let the exhale be longer than the inhale, a small tide going out, carrying a little more than the inhale brought in. The body releasing by degrees into the support beneath it. Feel the weight of the back against the bed, the weight of the legs, the weight of the arms resting without holding anything. Somewhere in Bhutan tonight, the Fo Chu and the Mo Chu are running together at the confluence where Punakadzong stands above them in the dark. The pine forests on the slopes of the Thimphu Valley are holding the cold mountain air. The passes through which Shabdrung crossed in 1616 are still high and white above the valley floors. The stars above them very clear at altitude. Very cold. Very far. And here, in this room, in this body, in this breath that is slowing toward rest, that same silence is available. It has been available all night. It has been here in every story, underneath every story, the ground that all 8 voices were standing on when they spoke. You have listened long enough. You have traveled far enough tonight. The building stands. Let the room hold you now. Let sleep arrive the way the silence came, not forced, not earned, not the result of sufficient understanding, but simply present when the effort finally stops. Everything that needed to be said tonight has been said. Everything that needed to be heard has already arrived in you, the way water arrives below the surface, present before you noticed it, deeper than the noticing. Rest now. The life you have made stands on its own while you sleep. It always has. The people you love are breathing somewhere in the dark. The work you have done is holding its own weight. The things you could not finish today will remain precisely where you left them and will be there in the morning light, no worse for having been set down, possibly better for the hours of not being held. Let the awareness that has been listening all night simply be here, without direction, not waiting for the next thought, not planning the next hour, just here. The way the awareness in Longchenpa's cave was simply here. The way the awareness in the empty meditation hall was simply here through the monsoon and the stopping of the monsoon. Here, the breath slowing, the body resting, the night doing what night has always done, holding the sleeping and the nearly sleeping and the ones who are watching the dark from somewhere between. The mountains somewhere very far away, still standing in the dark, and the rivers still running, and the room where the silence was kept, still holding whatever it holds. You are held. Somewhere, a raven flies south. Somewhere, a river finds the place where 2 waters meet. somewhere, a room holds a silence that has not broken in 400 years. Good night. You have traveled tonight through 8 centuries and 8 countries and 8 people who look directly at the thing most of us look away from. A Korean monk standing in the silence of a village that had died. A golden-footed young man bleeding on a forest path. A physician who had lost everyone and could not stop grieving. A king who walked away from his throne in the middle of the night. A hermit who gave his robe to a thief and sat watching the moon. A woman in a meditation hall while the monsoon passed through. A scholar in a Tibetan cave composing the clearest map of awareness ever written. A builder who entered a room and trusted what he had built to stand without him. None of them solved impermanence. None of them made it stop. What each of them discovered, in their own tradition, in their own particular way, is that the awareness inside you, the quiet watching that was present through every story tonight, has never been touched by what it witnesses. You may not remember much of what you heard. That is exactly right. The wisdom you received tonight does not require memory to work. It is already settled below the level of recall. The way water moves below the surface of a landscape. I chose these 8 voices because each one of them, at some point in their lives, was carrying something they could not set down and then found, not through effort but through a particular quality of presence, that the setting down was possible. I have needed that reminder lately more than I can say. If you wake tonight or tomorrow with the same concerns you brought to bed, that is ordinary. The concerns are real. They matter. What has changed, perhaps, is the space they are sitting inside. A little more room. A little more sky. If something you heard tonight stays with you into the day, let it. If nothing stays but the sense that you slept more deeply than you expected, that is enough. That has always been enough. If this video found you at the right moment, please consider sharing it with someone else who might need to hear that impermanence is not the enemy. That is how this work continues. Sleep well, or sleep deeply. If well is asking too much tonight, you are not the river. You are the awareness that the river moves through, and awareness does not need to hold on. Good night.